Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the complete and entire history of the collapse of the Lancasters, a tragic dynasty that ruled England for nearly a century before meeting its dramatic end in blood and betrayal. We'll softly explore the rise and fall of this noble house, from Henry III's bold usurpation of the crown to the gentle madness of Henry VI, from Margaret of Anjou's fierce maternal devotion to the tragic death of young Edward of Lancaster, and finally to Henry Tudor's miraculous restoration of the family name at Bosworth Field, all while the roses of Lancaster and York painted England crimson with their endless feuds. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. And you know what? Don't be shy. I'd love to hear from you gentle souls in the comments below. Maybe share which royal story touches your heart the most, or simply say hello so I know you're there listening to these midnight tales with me. Your kind words always warm my heart, and subscribing keeps these soothing historical journeys coming your way. So cozy up under your softest blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into the most restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family, where every night brings a new adventure through time. Henry, later known as Henry IV of England, never imagined that a simple act of rebellion would plant the seeds of his family's destruction. Born into nobility as Henry Bolingbroke in 1367, he was the son of John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster, and fourth son of the great King Edward III. The young Henry grew up in the gilded halls of medieval England, surrounded by the whispered politics and grand ceremonies that would shape his destiny. The Lancaster name itself carried ancient weight and dignity. It traced its roots back to Edmund Crouchback, the second son of King Henry III, who had been granted the earldom of Lancaster in 1267. Through marriages and inheritances, the family had accumulated vast lands stretching across England, making them among the most powerful noble houses in the realm. Their red rose badge, derived from the golden rose of Edward VI, would become a symbol known throughout history, though none could foresee the blood it would eventually represent. Henry's father, John of Gaunt, was perhaps the most influential man in England during the late 14th century. As Duke of Lancaster, he controlled enormous wealth and commanded the loyalty of thousands of retainers. Through his marriages, he had claims to thrones across Europe, including Castile and Leon. Most importantly for the future, his children, by his third wife, Catherine Swynford, would be legitimized as the Beaufort line, a decision that would echo through the centuries and ultimately restore the Lancaster name when all seemed lost. The world of Henry's youth was one of chivalric romance and brutal reality existing side by side. Tournaments and pageantry masked the underlying tensions of a kingdom strained by foreign wars and internal divisions. The Black Death had swept through England just decades before Henry's birth, killing perhaps a third of the population and leaving deep social and economic scars. Peasant revolts erupted in 1381, shaking the foundations of feudal society and forcing the nobility to confront the changing nature of their world. Young Henry grew into a man of considerable ability and ambition. Unlike many nobles of his era, he was well educated and spoke multiple languages fluently. He proved himself in battle, joining crusading expeditions to Prussia and the Holy Land, where he earned a reputation for courage and piety. His marriage to Mary de Bohun brought him additional lands and strengthened his position among the great families of England. Everything seemed to mark him as a loyal supporter of the crown, a pillar of the established order. But the established order was crumbling under the rule of his cousin, King Richard II. Richard, who had inherited the throne as a child, had grown into a monarch whose vision of royal authority clashed dramatically with the expectations of his nobles. Where medieval kings were expected to rule in consultation with their great magnates, Richard sought to concentrate power in his own hands. He surrounded himself with favourites who lacked the ancient bloodlines and broad support that traditional advisors possessed. The tension between Richard and his nobles had been building for years, when Henry found himself drawn into the struggle. In 1397, Richard moved against several prominent nobles, including Henry's uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, who died in royal custody under mysterious circumstances. The king's increasingly erratic behaviour and apparent willingness to remove potential threats alarmed the entire nobility, but none more so than Henry himself. The crisis came to a head in 1398, when Henry became embroiled in a bitter dispute with Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. The two men accused each other of treasonous statements, leading to the medieval ritual of trial by combat. However, just as the two champions were about to fight, Richard II intervened and banished both men from England. Henry was sentenced to 6 years of exile, while Mowbray received a life sentence. This exile proved to be the turning point not just for Henry personally, but for the entire Lancaster dynasty. Stripped of his English lands and titles, Henry travelled to Paris, where he was received at the court of his brother-in-law, King Charles VI of France. The French court, always interested in English internal divisions, provided Henry with both refuge and a base from which to observe the continuing deterioration of Richard's rule. The news that reached Henry in his French exile grew increasingly disturbing. Richard's governance became more arbitrary and unpredictable. The king imposed forced loans on his subjects, seized property without legal justification, and ruled through a small circle of advisors who isolated him from the broader nobility. Most ominously for Henry personally, rumours began to circulate that Richard planned to disinherit him entirely and name someone else as heir to his father's vast Lancaster inheritance. When John of Gaunt died in February 1399, the crisis became immediate and personal. Rather than allowing Henry to inherit his father's titles and lands, Richard II declared the Lancaster inheritance forfeit and began distributing its properties among his supporters. This act of royal tyranny crossed a line that even Richard's previous arbitrary actions had not approached. By seizing the rightful inheritance of one of England's greatest noble families, the king threatened the fundamental principle that governed aristocratic society. Henry's response was swift and decisive. In June 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Henry landed at Ravenspur on the Yorkshire coast with a small force of supporters. His stated intention was merely to reclaim his rightful inheritance as Duke of Lancaster, not to challenge the king's throne. This carefully chosen position allowed other discontented nobles to support him without immediately committing to treason. The speed with which Henry's small invasion force grew into a powerful army revealed the depth of opposition to Richard's rule. As word spread of the Lancaster heir's return, nobles and common people alike flocked to his banner. The Percy family, among the most powerful in northern England, declared for Henry almost immediately. The Earl of Northumberland and his son, the famous Harry Hotspur, brought not only their own retainers but also their prestige and military experience. Richard II's position collapsed with stunning rapidity. When he returned from Ireland to find his kingdom in rebellion, he discovered that his support had evaporated. Many of his closest advisors had already fled or switched sides. The king found himself virtually alone, his tyrannical rule having alienated even those who might naturally have supported the principle of royal authority. The final confrontation came not in battle, but in negotiation. Richard, isolated and friendless, was forced to meet with Henry and the rebel nobles at Flint Castle in Wales. The scene, later immortalized by Shakespeare, saw a king stripped of everything but his title facing the man who would soon take even that from him. Richard's attempts to assert his divine right to rule fell on deaf ears among men who had witnessed too many years of arbitrary governance. On September 30th, 1399, Richard II formally abdicated the throne of England, though the extent to which this abdication was voluntary remains debated by historians. Henry had originally sworn only to reclaim his father's lands, but the logic of the situation pushed him inexorably toward the crown itself. With Richard deposed and no clear alternative heir, the Lancaster claim through descent from Edward III became the strongest available. Henry IV was crowned King of England on October 13, 1399, in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony sought to emphasize legitimacy and continuity, with all the traditional rituals and regalia being employed. Henry took care to present himself not as a usurper, but as the rightful heir, claiming descent from Edward III through a senior line than Richard II had represented. The new king's supporters spread stories that Richard had never been the legitimate king, having supposedly been born of adultery. Yet for all the pageantry and propaganda, the uncomfortable truth remained that Henry IV had taken the throne by force from an anointed king. This act of successful rebellion, while solving the immediate crisis of Richard's tyrannical rule, created a dangerous precedent that would haunt the Lancaster dynasty for generations. If a king could be deposed for misgovernment, what prevented any powerful noble with royal blood from making a similar attempt when circumstances favoured them? The early years of Henry IV's reign were marked by constant rebellions and attempts to restore the previous dynasty. Richard II's supporters, though scattered, never fully accepted the Lancaster usurpation. More dangerous still were the great nobles who had supported Henry's initial claim, but who grew discontented with his rule. The Percy family, whose support had been crucial to Henry's success, turned against him when their expectations of reward and influence were not met to their satisfaction. The Welsh presented another source of continuous trouble. Owen Glendower, a Welsh nobleman with his own royal pretensions, launched a rebellion that would last for over a decade. The Welsh uprising was particularly dangerous because it attracted support from both discontented English nobles and foreign powers eager to see England weakened by internal division. France and Scotland both provided aid to Glendower, turning a domestic rebellion into an international conflict. Perhaps most tragically for Henry personally, his health began to fail in the middle years of his reign. What appeared to be a skin condition, possibly leprosy, left him increasingly disfigured and forced him to rely more heavily on his advisors and his eldest son. Some contemporaries saw this illness as divine punishment for his usurpation of Richard II, a belief that added a supernatural dimension to the political opposition he faced. The question of Richard II's fate cast a long shadow over Henry's reign. The deposed king had initially been kept alive in various prisons, but his continued existence provided a focus for opposition plots. When yet another conspiracy formed around Richard in early 1400, the former king died in Pontefract Castle under circumstances that remain mysterious. While Henry IV was never directly implicated in Richard's death, the convenience of its timing led many to suspect royal involvement. The burden of kingship weighed heavily on Henry IV, and he seems to have recognized the problems he had created for his dynasty. His coronation had been marked by several ill omens, including the discovery that his head was crawling with lice when the crown was placed upon it. Contemporary chroniclers recorded these signs with the kind of detail that suggests they were seen as divinely significant, markers of a reign that was somehow illegitimate or cursed. Despite these challenges, Henry IV did succeed in establishing the Lancaster dynasty on the English throne. His marriage to Joan of Navarre provided him with a capable partner who helped stabilize his court, though she never bore him children to strengthen his line. His sons by his first wife, particularly the future Henry V, proved themselves capable warriors and administrators. The dynasty's survival through its first generation gave it a legitimacy that mere success in battle could not provide. The transformation of Henry Bolingbroke from exile to king represents one of the most dramatic political reversals in English history. Within months, a man stripped of lands and titles had become the most powerful person in the realm. Yet this success came at a cost that would be paid by his descendants. The Lancaster dynasty had gained a crown, but they had also inherited a legacy of rebellion and usurpation that would make their own position perpetually vulnerable to challenge. Henry IV died in 1413 in the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster Abbey, reportedly fulfilling a prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem. His death came as something of a relief to a kingdom exhausted by years of rebellion and uncertainty. The crown passed smoothly to his eldest son, Henry V, whose military genius and charismatic leadership would temporarily obscure the fundamental weaknesses in the Lancaster position. The reign of Henry IV established patterns that would define the Lancaster experience of kingship. Future Lancaster monarchs would face constant challenges to their legitimacy. Nobles who felt entitled to rebel when their interests were threatened, and the burden of proving themselves worthy of a crown that had been won by force rather than inherited by clear right. The Red Rose of Lancaster, beautiful though it was, would be watered with far too much blood in the years to come. Henry, later known as Henry V of England, inherited far more than a crown from his father. He inherited the weight of justifying a dynasty's existence. Born around 1386, the future king spent his youth watching his father struggle to maintain a throne won through rebellion. The lessons learned during those formative years would shape him into one of England's most celebrated monarchs, though his very success would create expectations that his successors could never hope to meet. The young Prince Henry, often called Hal by his contemporaries, grew up in a court perpetually threatened by rebellion and conspiracy. His father's reign was marked by Welsh uprisings, Scottish border conflicts, and persistent challenges from nobles who questioned the Lancaster right to rule. This atmosphere of constant warfare and political uncertainty forged the prince into a capable military commander and a shrewd political operator while still in his teens. Prince Henry's first taste of real warfare came in Wales, where Owen Glendower's rebellion had been raging since 1400. The Welsh uprising was more than a simple revolt. It was a sophisticated nationalist movement that combined military action with diplomatic alliances and appeals to Celtic identity. Glendower himself was an educated man who had studied at the Inns of Court in London and understood both Welsh traditions and English weaknesses. His rebellion attracted support from Scotland and France, making it an international as well as domestic threat. The prince's experiences in Wales were formative in ways that extended far beyond military tactics. He learned to fight in difficult terrain against an enemy that refused to meet English armies in conventional battle. The Welsh preferred guerrilla warfare, striking quickly and then melting back into their mountain strongholds. This taught the young prince patience, adaptability, and the importance of logistics, lessons that would serve him well in France. More importantly, the Welsh campaigns taught Prince Henry about the nature of loyalty and leadership. He saw how his father struggled to maintain the allegiance of English nobles, whose support was conditional and self-interested. He witnessed the cost of the Percy Rebellion, when former allies became bitter enemies over questions of reward and recognition. These experiences convinced him that a king must not only win battles, but must also win hearts and minds through consistent demonstration of valor and justice. The relationship between Henry IV and his eldest son was complex and sometimes strained. The king's declining health meant that Prince Henry effectively ruled much of England during the later years of the reign, but this arrangement created confusion about authority and bred resentment among some nobles who preferred to deal directly with the king. Contemporary chronicles hint at tensions between father and son over policy, particularly regarding the ongoing war in France and the handling of domestic opposition. When Henry V inherited the throne in 1413 at the age of 26, he moved quickly to establish his own identity as king. Unlike his father, who had always seemed somewhat defensive about his right to rule, the new king projected supreme confidence in his royal authority. His coronation was marked by elaborate ceremonies designed to emphasize his legitimacy and his connection to England's glorious past. The new king made it clear that he intended to be remembered not as the son of a usurper, but as a worthy successor to Edward III and the Black Prince. Henry V's transformation from the allegedly wild Prince Hal of legend to the pious and determined king surprised many contemporaries. While historians debate the extent to which the stories of his youthful debauchery were accurate or merely later inventions, there is no question that his behavior changed dramatically upon assuming the crown. The new king embraced a rigid personal morality, attended religious services daily, and surrounded himself with advisors known for their competence rather than their ability to entertain. The decision to renew the war with France was perhaps the defining moment of Henry V's reign. England's claims to French territory dated back over a century to Edward III's assertion of rights through his mother's lineage. The 100 Years' War had been dormant during Henry IV's reign, as domestic challenges consumed royal attention. But Henry V saw the resumption of French warfare as essential to his dynasty's survival. The political calculations behind Henry's French ambitions were sophisticated and far-reaching. A successful foreign war would unite the English nobility behind their king, diverting their attention from domestic grievances and providing opportunities for glory and profit that would bind them more closely to the Lancaster cause. Victory in France would also demonstrate divine approval of the Lancaster dynasty, answering critics who still questioned the legitimacy of Henry IV's usurpation. Henry I's preparations for the French campaign were meticulous and revealed his attention to detail. Unlike many medieval military expeditions, which were often launched with inadequate supplies and poor planning, Henry's invasion force was carefully organized and well-equipped. The king personally supervised the gathering of supplies, the recruitment of troops, and the construction of siege engines. He studied maps, consulted with merchants familiar with French ports, and established supply lines before his army ever left England. The diplomatic preparation was equally thorough. Henry V reopened negotiations with various French factions, playing different groups against each other while building his case for English rights. The French kingdom was weakened by civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, powerful noble factions whose rivalry had paralyzed effective royal government. Henry skillfully exploited these divisions, positioning himself as the legitimate claimant who could restore order to France. When Henry's army landed in Normandy in August 1415, it represented one of the best organized and most professional military forces of the medieval period. The king had learned from his father's experiences and from English defeats earlier in the 100 Years' War. His army combined the traditional English strengths, longbow archery and disciplined infantry, with newer tactical innovations and improved siege techniques. The siege of Harfleur, Henry's first major action in France, demonstrated both his military capabilities and his ruthless determination. The port city was strongly fortified and well defended, requiring a prolonged investment that tested English logistics and resolve. Henry personally supervised the siege operations, sharing the hardships of his soldiers and maintaining morale through his visible presence and leadership. When the city finally surrendered after more than a month, it provided the English with a secure base for future operations. The march from Harfleur toward Calais that led to the Battle of Agincourt was not originally intended as a campaign of conquest. Henry's army had been weakened by disease during the siege, and many of his original plans had to be abandoned. The decision to march overland to Calais was partly driven by practical necessity. The English needed to reach friendly territory before winter made further campaigning impossible. The French response to Henry's march revealed the divisions and overconfidence that would contribute to their defeat. Instead of allowing the English to withdraw unmolested, French nobles competed for the honor of destroying the invading army. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, assembled a massive force that far outnumbered Henry's weakened army, but the French commanders could not agree on tactics or leadership. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on October 25, 1415, became one of the most famous victories in English military history. The battle took place on a narrow field between two woods, terrain that favored the English defensive position and neutralized the French advantage in heavy cavalry. Henry positioned his army carefully, with dismounted men-at-arms in the center, supported by longbow archers on the flanks whose stakes and obstacles channeled French attacks into killing zones. The French assault, when it came, was poorly coordinated and tactically disastrous. Successive waves of heavily armored knights struggled through muddy ground under constant arrow fire, arriving at the English lines exhausted and disorganized. The English men-at-arms, fighting on foot with weapons designed for close combat, proved more than a match for French cavalry that had lost its mobility and shock effect. Henry V's personal role in the battle enhanced his legendary status. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting in the front ranks, his crown making him a conspicuous target for French attacks. When his younger brother, the Duke of Gloucester, was wounded and fallen, the king personally defended him until he could be carried to safety. These acts of personal courage, combined with tactical brilliance, made Henry a hero to his troops and to later generations. The aftermath of Agincourt was almost as important as the battle itself. The English had captured or killed much of the French nobility, including the constable and numerous dukes and counts. The psychological impact of the victory was enormous, convincing many that God favored the English cause and that Henry V was, indeed, the rightful King of France. The battle also provided substantial ransoms that helped finance Henry's future campaigns. Henry's return to England after Agincourt was a triumph that surpassed even his military victories. The king was greeted as a conquering hero, with elaborate pageants and celebrations marking his progress through his kingdom. The victory had accomplished exactly what Henry had hoped. It united the English nobility behind their king and silenced questions about Lancaster legitimacy. For the first time since Henry IV's usurpation, the dynasty seemed secure on the English throne. The years following Agincourt saw Henry V systematically conquest of Normandy. Unlike his predecessors, who had often sought quick raids and temporary gains, Henry was determined to establish permanent English control over his French territories. His approach combined military conquest with administrative organization, establishing English law and governance in captured territories while respecting local customs where possible. The siege of Rouen in 1418-1419 exemplified Henry's methodical approach to warfare. The Norman capital was one of the strongest cities in France, and its capture required a siege lasting more than 6 months. Henry's forces surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supplies and communications while maintaining their own supply lines from England. The king's personal supervision of the siege operations and his refusal to be diverted by French relief attempts demonstrated the focused determination that characterized his entire French campaign. Henry's diplomatic achievements were as impressive as his military conquests. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the culmination of his French ambitions, recognizing him as regent of France and heir to the French throne. The treaty was sealed by his marriage to Catherine of Valois, daughter of the Mad King Charles VI, creating a dynastic union that seemed to promise permanent peace between the two kingdoms. The Treaty of Troyes was a diplomatic masterpiece that exploited French internal divisions while appearing to offer a legitimate solution to the succession crisis. By marrying into the French royal family and accepting recognition as heir, Henry transformed himself from a foreign conqueror into a member of the French dynasty. The treaty also provided for his children to inherit both crowns, creating the possibility of a united Anglo-French kingdom that would dominate Western Europe. Yet even as Henry V reached the pinnacle of his success, the seeds of future problems were already visible. The Dauphin Charles, the legitimate heir to the French throne, had rejected the Treaty of Troyes and continued to claim royal authority from his strongholds south of the Loire River. Much of France remained unconquered, and maintaining English control over the territories already won required constant military effort and enormous financial resources. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois was both a political triumph and a personal happiness. The French princess proved to be an intelligent and capable partner who adapted well to English court life. Their wedding at Troyes Cathedral in June 1420 was celebrated throughout Henry's dominions as the symbolic union of two great kingdoms. When Catherine was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey in 1421, it seemed to mark the definitive establishment of the Lancaster dynasty's international prestige. The birth of the future Henry II in December 1421 represented the apparent fulfillment of all Henry V's dynastic ambitions. The infant prince was heir to both England and France, born into a position of unprecedented potential power. Contemporary chronicles describe elaborate celebrations and expressions of hope that this child would complete his father's work of uniting the two kingdoms under English rule. Tragically, Henry V would not live to see his son grow up or to complete the conquest of France. The king's health had been undermined by years of campaigning, and he contracted what appears to have been dysentery during the Siege of Meaux in 1422. Despite his illness, Henry continued to direct military operations and to plan for the future governance of his French territories. His dedication to duty, even unto death, became part of his legend. Henry V died at the Château de Vincennes, near Paris, on August 31st, 1422, just 2 months before his 36th birthday. His death came at the moment of his greatest success, when his armies controlled much of northern France, and his diplomatic achievements seemed to promise lasting peace. The king's final words, as recorded by contemporary chroniclers, expressed concern for his infant son and confidence that his brothers would continue his work. The impact of Henry V's death on the Lancaster dynasty cannot be overstated. In the space of less than a decade, he had transformed his family from embattled usurpers into the most powerful royal house in Europe. His military genius, personal charisma, and political skill had created an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Loire River. More importantly, his achievements had finally silenced questions about Lancaster legitimacy and had given his dynasty a prestige that seemed unshakable. Yet Henry V's very success created expectations that would prove impossible to maintain. His infant son would inherit a crown that required constant military action to defend, a nobility accustomed to foreign conquests and their profits, and enemies who had been temporarily subdued but never permanently defeated. The warrior king's glory would cast a shadow over his successors that none of them could escape, and his achievements would become a standard of comparison that highlighted their relative failures. The funeral of Henry V was a magnificent display of royal ceremony designed to emphasize continuity and the permanence of his achievements. His body was carried from France to England in a procession that celebrated his victories while mourning his loss. The funeral service in Westminster Abbey was attended by representatives from across Europe, acknowledging the international significance of his reign and his dynasty's elevated status. Henry V's legacy was complex and contradictory. His military achievements had restored English pride and temporarily secured the Lancaster dynasty, but they had also committed England to an impossible task of permanently conquering and holding France. His personal example of royal leadership was inspiring but essentially unrepeatable, setting a standard that would make his successors appear weak by comparison. Most tragically, his early death meant that his infant son would face challenges that required an adult king's personal leadership and charismatic authority. The reign of Henry IV represents the high point of Lancaster power and prestige. For a brief moment, it seemed that Henry III's gamble in usurping Richard II had been vindicated by divine favour and human achievement. The Red Rose of Lancaster flew over territories from the Scottish borders to the gates of Paris, and the dynasty's future appeared secure for generations to come. But the wheel of fortune that had raised the Lancasters so high was already beginning its inevitable turn downward, and the glory days would prove to be tragically brief. Henry, later known as Henry VI of England, entered the world at Windsor Castle on December 6, 1421, inheriting a legacy that no child should ever have to bear. At just 8 months and 26 days old, he became King of England following his father's death from dysentery during the Siege of Meaux. 2 months later, when his maternal grandfather Charles VI of France died, baby Henry also became King of France, making him the youngest person ever to hold both crowns simultaneously. The infant king's inheritance was both magnificent and impossible. Henry V's conquests had created an Anglo-French empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Loire Valley. But maintaining this vast territory required constant military action, enormous financial resources, and political unity that existed only as long as victories continued. The baby who gurgled in his cradle at Windsor was expected to grow up and complete his father's work of permanently uniting two ancient kingdoms that had been enemies for centuries. The regency arrangements made for Henry VI reflected both the careful planning of Henry V and the fundamental contradictions in the political system he had created. In his will, the dying king had appointed his brothers to serve as regents. John, Duke of Bedford, was to govern France and continue the military campaigns there, while Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was to rule England. This division of authority seemed practical, but it immediately created competing centres of power and differing priorities that would plague the minority reign. Bedford proved to be a capable military commander and administrator who understood his brother's vision for the Anglo-French Empire. He continued the systematic conquest of French territories while maintaining the delicate diplomatic balance that kept Burgundy allied with England against the Dauphin Charles. Bedford's marriage to Anne of Burgundy in 1423 cemented this crucial alliance and provided the English cause with the legitimacy it needed to maintain control over northern France. Gloucester's regency in England was more troubled from the beginning. Unlike his brother Bedford, who had clear military objectives and foreign enemies to fight, Gloucester faced the more subtle but equally dangerous challenge of managing English domestic politics during a royal minority. The Duke of Gloucester was an intelligent and cultured man who later became famous as a patron of humanist learning. But he lacked the political skills necessary to build consensus among the great nobles, who expected to share power during the king's minority. The most significant challenge to Gloucester's authority came from his uncle, Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester. Beaufort was the wealthiest and most influential prelate in England, a man whose loans had helped finance Henry V's French campaigns and whose political connections extended throughout Europe. The bishop represented the Beaufort branch of the Lancaster family tree, descendants of John of Gaunt's legitimised children by Catherine Swynford, and he had his own ideas about how England should be governed during the royal minority. The rivalry between Gloucester and Beaufort was more than a personal conflict. It represented different visions of England's future. Gloucester favoured continuing his brother's aggressive military policies in France, maintaining the war effort regardless of cost, in order to complete the conquest that Henry V had begun. Beaufort took a more pragmatic view, recognising that England's resources were finite and that compromise with France might be necessary to preserve what had already been won. Young King Henry VI grew up surrounded by these political tensions, never experiencing the normal childhood that might have prepared him for the enormous responsibilities he would eventually have to assume. The royal household was organised around the complex protocols of medieval court life, with elaborate ceremonies marking every aspect of the boy king's daily routine. From his earliest years, Henry was treated as a sacred figure whose person embodied the divine authority of kingship. But this treatment also isolated him from normal human relationships and practical experience of the world. The education provided for Henry VI was extensive but largely theoretical. The finest scholars in England were brought to court to instruct the young king in Latin, French, theology, law, and history. He was taught the genealogies that justified his claims to both the English and French thrones, the military strategies his father had employed in winning his victories, and the diplomatic principles that governed relations between medieval kingdoms. However, this formal education could not provide the practical political skills and personal charisma that effective kingship required. Contemporary accounts suggest that Henry VI was an intelligent child who learned his lessons well and showed particular interest in religious matters. His tutors reported that he had a remarkable memory for scripture and theological arguments, and that he displayed an unusual degree of piety for someone so young. These characteristics, which would later define his adult personality, were encouraged by a court that saw royal piety as both politically useful and morally commendable. The young king's first public appearances were carefully choreographed to emphasize continuity with his father's reign and the legitimacy of his dual inheritance. His coronation as King of England took place in Westminster Abbey on November 6, 1429, when he was not quite 8 years old. The ceremony followed traditional forms, but included special prayers and rituals designed to emphasize divine approval of his rule. The crown had to be held steady on his small head, and contemporary chroniclers noted both the solemnity of the occasion and the poignancy of seeing such a young child invested with such enormous responsibilities. Henry VI's coronation as King of France in Paris on December 16, 1431, was an even more complex political event. The ceremony took place in Notre Dame Cathedral, rather than the traditional Reims, because the English did not control Reims, which was held by supporters of the rival Dauphin Charles. The 10-year-old king conducted himself with remarkable composure during the long and elaborate ritual, but the political context made the occasion both a triumph and a symbol of the incomplete nature of English conquest. The problem of Joan of Arc had emerged during Henry's minority reign as both a military and a propaganda challenge to English authority in France. The peasant girl who claimed divine inspiration to drive the English from France had succeeded in lifting the siege of Orléans and enabling the Dauphin's coronation as Charles VII at Reims. Although Joan herself was captured and executed in 1431, her early successes had demonstrated that French resistance remained strong and that English control was far from secure. Bedford's death in 1435 marked the beginning of the end for the English Empire in France. The Duke of Bedford had been the last English leader who combined military competence with political vision, and his death removed the only man capable of holding together the complex alliance system that maintained English power. Almost immediately after Bedford's death, the Duke of Burgundy began negotiations to abandon the English alliance and reconcile with Charles VII of France. The Congress of Arras in 1435 represented England's last real opportunity to secure a negotiated settlement that might have preserved some of Henry V's conquests. However, the English delegation, representing a government dominated by Gloucester's war party, demanded terms that were completely unrealistic given the military situation. When the Burgundians and French reached a separate agreement that excluded England, it marked the effective end of the Anglo-French Empire that Henry V had created. As Henry VI approached his majority, the political situation in both his kingdoms was deteriorating rapidly. In France, English forces were being steadily pushed back from territories that had been conquered at enormous cost in blood and treasure. The great fortress of Harfleur, Henry VI's first conquest, fell to the French in 1440. More symbolically devastating, the English were expelled from Paris in 1436, losing the political and ceremonial centre of their French kingdom. The domestic situation in England was equally troubling. The costs of maintaining the war in France had strained royal finances to the breaking point, requiring constant parliamentary grants and forced loans that bred resentment among taxpayers. The great nobles, who had profited from Henry VI's conquests, now faced the prospect of losing their French lands and the revenues they provided. Political unity, which had been maintained during the victorious years, began to fracture as different factions blamed each other for the deteriorating situation. Henry VI formally assumed personal rule in 1437 at age 16, but his transition to active kingship revealed the fundamental mismatch between his personality and the demands of his position. The young king was genuinely pious, personally modest, and sincerely committed to peace and justice, but these admirable qualities were poorly suited to the brutal realities of medieval politics and warfare. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had possessed the ruthless determination necessary for effective kingship, Henry VI displayed a gentle nature that his enemies interpreted as weakness. He genuinely preferred prayer and study to the hunt and tournament, activities that were considered essential for maintaining royal prestige among the warrior nobility. Most problematically, he showed little interest in the details of government and military planning, preferring to delegate authority to advisors whose competence and loyalty varied dramatically. The king's personality became most apparent in his approach to the ongoing war in France, where Henry V had personally led his armies and shared the hardships of campaign life. Henry VI viewed warfare as a regrettable necessity that should be ended as quickly as possible through negotiation, rather than continued through military action. This attitude was admirable from a moral perspective, but disastrous from a practical one, since it encouraged French resistance while demoralizing English forces who expected their king to lead them to victory. The marriage negotiations that dominated the early years of Henry VI's personal rule reflected both the king's pacific inclinations and the desperate English need for allies. Various potential brides were considered, including daughters of the French royal family, the Count of Armagnac, and several German princes. Each marriage proposal involved complex diplomatic calculations about alliances, dowries, and territorial concessions that required careful political management. The eventual decision to marry Margaret of Anjou in 1445 represented a triumph of hope over experience. Margaret was the 15-year-old daughter of René of Anjou, a minor French noble whose grandiose titles concealed his actual poverty and political weakness. The marriage was supposed to bring peace with France through René's connections to the French court, but the price demanded by the French was the cession of Maine and Anjou, territories that had been conquered at enormous cost during Henry VI's campaigns. The marriage negotiations revealed Henry VI's fundamental misunderstanding of the political situation he faced. The king genuinely believed that personal goodwill and Christian charity could overcome the deep-seated conflicts between England and France, and he was prepared to make territorial concessions that his nobles considered both unnecessary and humiliating. The secret promise to surrender Maine, made without parliamentary consent, would later become a source of bitter controversy and a symbol of the king's political incompetence. Margaret of Anjou's arrival in England in 1445 brought both hope and additional complications to the Lancaster court. The new queen was intelligent, strong-willed, and politically sophisticated in ways that her husband was not. She quickly understood the factional divisions among the English nobility and began building her own network of supporters and allies. However, her foreign birth and French connections made her suspect to many English nobles who already questioned the wisdom of the royal marriage. The Queen's influence over her husband became apparent almost immediately, and it was not always positive. Margaret encouraged Henry's pacific inclinations while simultaneously involving herself in court politics in ways that violated traditional expectations of queenly behavior. She formed close relationships with certain nobles while openly opposing others, creating new sources of division within the royal council and alienating powerful families whose support the dynasty needed. The collapse of English power in France accelerated dramatically. During the late 1440s and early 1450s, the French forces under Charles VII had been reorganized and re-equipped, transforming them from the feudal levies that Henry V had defeated into a professional army capable of sustained offensive operations. English garrisons found themselves isolated and outnumbered, unable to count on reinforcement from a home government that lacked both the will and the resources to maintain the overseas empire. The fall of Rouen in 1449 marked the effective end of English rule in Normandy. The city that Henry V had conquered after a 6-month siege was lost in a matter of weeks. Its English garrison, overwhelmed by French forces whose numerical superiority and superior artillery made resistance hopeless. The psychological impact of losing Rouen was enormous, since the Norman capital had been the administrative centre of the English Empire in France and the symbol of Henry V's greatest achievements. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 represented the final destruction of English military power in France. An English army attempting to relieve the garrison at Caen was decisively defeated by French forces using tactics and technology that the English had not adapted to counter. The longbow, which had been the foundation of English military superiority for over a century, proved ineffective against improved French armour and artillery. The defeat was so complete that organised English resistance in northern France effectively ceased. By 1453, English possessions in France had been reduced to the single port city of Calais. The vast empire that Henry V had created through 15 years of continuous warfare had been lost in less than a decade of defensive fighting. The financial and human costs of this disaster were staggering, but the psychological impact was even greater. The English nobility, accustomed to viewing France as a source of profit and glory, now faced the reality that their continental empire had vanished forever. The impact of these military disasters on Henry VI personally was catastrophic. The king, who had already shown signs of mental instability, suffered what appears to have been a complete psychological breakdown in August 1453. Contemporary sources describe him as becoming completely unresponsive, unable to recognize even his closest associates, or to participate in any form of government. Modern historians have suggested various diagnoses for his condition, ranging from catatonic schizophrenia to severe depression, but all agree that he was completely incapable of ruling. The timing of Henry VI's mental collapse could hardly have been worse for the Lancaster dynasty. The loss of France had already created enormous domestic political pressures, with various noble factions blaming each other for the disaster and competing for influence over royal policy. The king's incapacity removed the one source of authority that might have held these factions together, creating a power vacuum that ambitious nobles were quick to exploit. The birth of Edward of Lancaster in October 1453, just 2 months after his father's mental breakdown, represented both hope and additional complications for the dynasty. The arrival of a male heir secured the Lancaster succession and provided a focus for loyalty among the king's supporters. However, the circumstances of the prince's birth, with the king unable to recognize or acknowledge his son, led to whispered rumors about the child's legitimacy that would plague Edward throughout his short life. The appointment of Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm in March 1454 marked the effective end of Lancaster control over England. York was the most powerful noble in the kingdom and possessed his own hereditary claim to the throne through descent from Edward III. His appointment as protector was presented as a temporary expedient necessary for the good governance of the kingdom, but everyone understood that it represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. York's protectorate revealed the depth of the problems that had accumulated during Henry VI's personal rule. The royal finances were in chaos, with debts that exceeded annual revenues by enormous margins. The administration of justice had broken down in many parts of the kingdom, with powerful nobles maintaining private armies and settling disputes through violence rather than legal process. Most dangerously, the loss of France had created a large population of unemployed soldiers and dispossessed nobles who had lost their overseas properties and were seeking new sources of income and advancement. The protector's attempts to restore order and financial stability were partially successful, but they also created new enemies among those who had profited from the chaos of weak royal government. York's efforts to reduce court expenses and eliminate corruption alienated the Queen's supporters, while his military preparations against Scotland and his attempts to recover some English possessions in France required parliamentary grants that were difficult to obtain and resented by taxpayers. Henry VI's recovery from his mental illness in December 1454 was sudden and complete, but it came too late to prevent the political crisis that his incapacity had created. The king appeared to remember nothing of the previous 18 months and was bewildered to learn that he had a son and that the kingdom's situation had changed dramatically. His resumption of active rule was welcomed by his supporters, but it also created an impossible situation with York, who had grown accustomed to exercising royal authority and was reluctant to surrender it. The First Battle of St. Albans on May 22, 1455, marked the beginning of the armed conflict that would later be called the Wars of the Roses. The battle arose from York's refusal to submit to Henry VI's restored authority and the king's determination to reassert his royal prerogatives. The engagement itself was brief and relatively small scale, more of a violent political confrontation than a major battle, but its consequences were enormous. The Yorkist victory at St. Albans fundamentally changed the nature of English politics. For the first time since Henry IV's usurpation, armed force had been used successfully against a reigning king on English soil. The precedent was ominous for the Lancaster dynasty, since it demonstrated that royal authority could be challenged by subjects who possessed sufficient military power and felt justified by their grievances. The death of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, at St. Albans removed one of Henry VI's most important supporters and created a blood feud between the royal family and York's faction. Somerset had been the king's chief advisor and the architect of his policies in France and domestic affairs. His violent death transformed political opposition into personal vendetta, making compromise between the factions much more difficult to achieve. Henry II's response to his defeat at St. Albans revealed both his personal weakness and his fundamental misunderstanding of the political situation. Instead of using royal authority to punish the rebels, the king attempted to achieve reconciliation through pardons and attempts at compromise. This merciful approach, while personally admirable, was interpreted by his enemies as further evidence of weakness and encouraged additional challenges to royal authority. The period between 1455 and 1459 saw a series of attempts to restore political stability through formal reconciliation between the royal family and the Yorkist faction. The most famous of these efforts was the Love Day of March 1458, when Henry VI presided over an elaborate ceremony of public reconciliation between the opposing nobles. However, these ceremonial gestures could not address the fundamental issues that had created the conflict, and they were undermined by the continuing personal animosities and conflicting ambitions of the participants. Queen Margaret's emergence as the real leader of the Lancastrian cause during this period reflected both her recognition of her husband's limitations and her determination to protect her son's inheritance. The Queen understood that Henry VI's gentle nature made him unsuitable for the brutal political struggles that the dynasty faced, and she was prepared to take on the role of political leadership that he could not fulfill. However, her activism violated traditional expectations of queenly behavior and provided additional ammunition for Yorkist propaganda. The renewal of open warfare in 1459 represented the failure of all attempts to resolve the crisis through negotiation and compromise. The Battle of Blore Heath in September 1459 saw a Yorkist force under the Earl of Salisbury defeat a royal army, demonstrating that the rebels had grown stronger and more confident since St. Albans. The subsequent Yorkist retreat from England after their defeat at Ludford Bridge appeared to end the immediate threat, but it proved to be only a temporary setback. The Yorkist return from exile in 1460 caught the Lancastrian government completely unprepared. The Battle of Northampton in July 1460 resulted in another royal defeat and the capture of Henry VI himself. More ominously for the dynasty, the Yorkist victory was achieved partly through treachery, as some supposedly loyal Lancastrian commanders defected to the enemy during the battle. The incident demonstrated that Lancaster support was shallow and unreliable, dependent on success and profit, rather than genuine loyalty. York's formal claim to the throne, presented to Parliament in October 1460, represented the culmination of the political crisis that had been building since Henry VI's mental breakdown. The Duke of York argued that his descent from Edward III through the female line gave him a better hereditary right to the crown than Henry VI's descent through the male line from Henry III, the usurper. This legal argument, while technically valid, overturned the fundamental principle that successful possession of the crown created legitimate authority. The parliamentary compromise that made York heir to the throne, while allowing Henry VI to remain king for his lifetime, satisfied no one and solved nothing. The agreement disinherited Prince Edward and guaranteed that Queen Margaret would never accept its terms. More fundamentally, it created two rival claimants to the throne, each with legal justification for their position, ensuring that civil war would continue regardless of any formal settlement. The Battle of Wakefield on December 30th, 1460, marked both a great Lancastrian victory and a personal tragedy that would haunt the dynasty for generations. The death of Richard, Duke of York, in the battle eliminated the primary threat to Henry VI's throne, but the manner of his death, killed while attempting to retreat from a battle his enemies had forced him to fight, created a martyrdom that strengthened rather than weakened the Yorkist cause. The brutality that marked the aftermath of Wakefield, with the heads of York and other defeated nobles displayed on the gates of York City, represented a departure from the relatively civilized conduct that had characterized earlier phases of the conflict. The Queen's apparent approval of these atrocities alienated moderate opinion and provided Yorkist propagandists with powerful ammunition for their claims that Margaret was unfit to influence English government. The Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461 gave the Lancastrians another tactical victory, but proved to be a strategic disaster. Although Margaret's forces defeated the Earl of Warwick and recaptured Henry VI, their failure to secure London allowed York's eldest son, Edward, to claim the crown and rally opposition to the Lancastrian cause. The citizens of London, terrified by reports of Lancastrian army discipline and remembering the brutalities after Wakefield, refused to admit the Queen's forces to the city. Edward of York's proclamation as King Edward IV on March 4, 1461, marked the effective end of Lancastrian rule in England. Although Henry VI remained alive and would briefly regain his throne a decade later, his dynasty's control over the English crown was broken forever. The gentle king, who had inherited such magnificent possibilities, would spend the remainder of his life as either a fugitive or a prisoner, a tragic symbol of the dynasty's ultimate failure. The transformation of Henry VI from the heir to two kingdoms into a powerless exile represented one of the most complete reversals of fortune in English royal history. The child who had been crowned in both Westminster Abbey and Notre Dame Cathedral, who had inherited the greatest empire in Western Europe, found himself dependent on Scottish and French charity for his very survival. His tragedy was both personal and political, the result of character flaws that might have been merely unfortunate in a private person, but proved catastrophic in a king. Henry II's legacy was complex and contradictory. His genuine piety and commitment to learning led to the foundation of Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, institutions that continue to benefit humanity centuries after his death. His personal kindness and forgiveness, while politically disastrous, reflected admirable moral qualities that were rare among medieval monarchs. Yet these virtues could not compensate for his fundamental inability to provide the leadership that his kingdom desperately needed. The collapse of Henry VI's reign established patterns that would define the remainder of the Lancaster story. The dynasty's survival would depend increasingly on the actions of strong-willed women rather than effective kings, on foreign support rather than domestic popularity, and on the hope of eventual restoration rather than the reality of secure power. The Red Rose of Lancaster, which had flown so proudly over the battlefields of France, would continue to appear on medieval banners, but it would be carried by exiles and rebels rather than by established rulers. Margaret, later known as Queen Margaret of Anjou, arrived in England in 1445 as a 15-year-old bride carrying the hopes of two kingdoms for peace. Born on March 23, 1430, in the Duchy of Lorraine, she was the daughter of René of Anjou, a man whose impressive collection of royal titles masked his actual poverty and political weakness. Her mother, Isabella of Lorraine, came from a family with deep connections to the French court and European diplomacy, providing young Margaret with an education in the complex world of medieval politics. The marriage negotiations that brought Margaret to England were part of a desperate English attempt to find a diplomatic solution to the continuing war with France. English military power had been steadily declining since the death of Henry V, and by the 1440s, the vast empire he had created was under constant pressure from resurgent French forces. The marriage was supposed to bring peace through Margaret's family connections to the French court, but the price demanded, the secret cession of Maine and Anjou, would prove politically disastrous. Margaret's journey from France to England in 1445 was a magnificent pageant designed to demonstrate the importance of the royal marriage and to present the new queen to her future subjects. The young bride travelled with a retinue of French nobles and attendants, stopping at various English ports and cities where elaborate celebrations marked her progress toward London. Contemporary chroniclers described her as beautiful, intelligent, and remarkably composed for someone so young facing such enormous responsibilities. The wedding ceremony itself, held at Titchfield Abbey on April 23, 1445, was a relatively modest affair compared to royal marriages of previous generations. The reduced scale of the festivities reflected both the strained state of English royal finances and the controversial nature of the marriage terms. However, Margaret's coronation as Queen of England, held in Westminster Abbey a few weeks later, was a magnificent display designed to emphasize her new status and to win the loyalty of her adopted subjects. Margaret's early years as queen were marked by her efforts to adapt to English court life, while navigating the complex factional politics that surrounded her husband. The young queen quickly demonstrated an intelligence and political acuity that contrasted sharply with Henry VI's gentle but ineffective approach to kingship. She formed relationships with powerful nobles, learned to read the subtle signs of court intrigue, and began to understand the financial and military challenges facing the kingdom. The Queen's foreign birth and French connections made her suspect to many English nobles from the very beginning of her reign. Anti-French sentiment, built up during decades of warfare, created a hostile environment that Margaret had to navigate carefully. Her every action was scrutinized for evidence of divided loyalties, and her correspondence with French relatives was monitored by suspicious English courtiers who questioned her commitment to her adopted kingdom. Margaret's relationship with her husband was both loving and increasingly frustrating. Henry VI's genuine piety and personal kindness made him an attractive companion, but his political weakness and reluctance to provide decisive leadership created enormous problems for the kingdom and the dynasty. The Queen gradually recognized that if the Lancaster cause was to survive, she would have to provide the strength and determination that her husband lacked. The 8-year delay in producing an heir created additional pressures for Margaret and raised questions about the royal marriage that had serious political implications. Medieval queens were expected to secure the succession as their primary duty, and the lack of royal children was interpreted by some as evidence of divine displeasure with the marriage or the dynasty itself. The Queen's apparent barrenness became a source of court gossip and political speculation that weakened the Lancaster position. The birth of Edward of Lancaster on October 13, 1453, should have been a moment of triumph for Margaret, but the circumstances surrounding the prince's arrival created new problems for the dynasty. Henry VI's mental breakdown had occurred just 2 months earlier, leaving him unable to recognize or acknowledge his son. This timing led to malicious rumors about the child's legitimacy, with enemies of the royal family suggesting that the prince was not Henry's son, but the result of an adulterous relationship. The rumors about Edward's paternity were never supported by credible evidence, but they served the political purposes of those who wanted to weaken the Lancaster claim to the throne. Margaret's close relationships with various nobles, particularly Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, provided ammunition for scandalmongers who chose to interpret political alliances as romantic entanglements. The Queen's strong personality and active involvement in politics made such accusations easier for her enemies to spread and harder for her supporters to dismiss. Margaret's response to her husband's mental illness revealed both her political capabilities and her willingness to violate traditional gender roles when circumstances demanded it. During the king's incapacity, she attempted to establish herself as regent for her infant son, arguing that she had both the right and the duty to govern in the king's absence. This unprecedented claim to formal political power shocked many contemporaries and provided additional evidence for her critics that she was unfit for queenly authority. The appointment of Richard, Duke of York, as protector during Henry's illness was a devastating blow to Margaret's political ambitions and to the Lancaster cause generally. York represented everything that Margaret most feared: a powerful noble with his own claim to the throne, military experience that Henry VI lacked, and political skills that enabled him to build coalitions among discontented magnates. The protectorship gave York legitimate authority that he used to reward his supporters and to undermine the Queen's faction. Margaret's determination to remove York from power, once Henry VI recovered, created the political crisis that led to the Wars of the Roses. The Queen correctly understood that York's ambitions posed an existential threat to her son's inheritance, and that compromise with such a dangerous enemy was impossible. Her efforts to exclude York from government and to restore her own supporters to positions of authority drove the Duke to desperate measures that culminated in the First Battle of St. Albans. The Yorkist victory at St. Albans in 1455 transformed Margaret from a queen consort into a military leader, a role for which her education and experience had not prepared her, but which she embraced with remarkable determination. The death of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, in the battle eliminated one of her most important supporters and created a personal vendetta that would drive much of her subsequent political activity. Margaret understood that York's faction would never allow her son to inherit the throne peacefully, and that military action was the only means of protecting the Lancaster claim. Margaret's emergence as the real leader of the Lancastrian cause during the late 1450s represented a revolutionary development in English politics. Medieval queens were expected to influence policy through private consultation with their husbands, not through public political leadership and military command. Margaret's willingness to violate these traditional constraints scandalized her contemporaries, but reflected her accurate assessment that traditional approaches would not save her dynasty. The Queen's political methods during this period were both effective and controversial. She built a network of supporters through carefully distributed patronage, using royal resources to reward loyalty and to punish opposition. Her control over access to the king gave her enormous influence over government appointments and policy decisions. However, her partisan approach to politics alienated moderate nobles who might have supported the dynasty if they had been treated more inclusively. Margaret's relationship with Henry VI during these crisis years was complex and sometimes strained. The king's preference for reconciliation and forgiveness conflicted with the Queen's recognition that their enemies could not be trusted and must be destroyed. Henry's attempts to achieve peace through ceremonial reconciliations, such as the famous Love Day of 1458, were undermined by Margaret's more realistic understanding that the Yorkist threat was existential and required decisive military action. The Queen's increasing involvement in military planning and strategy represented an unprecedented expansion of royal feminine authority. Margaret personally supervised the recruitment of troops, negotiated with Scottish and French allies for military support, and developed strategic plans for campaigns against Yorkist forces. Her letters from this period, written in her own hand, reveal a detailed understanding of military logistics and tactical considerations that few medieval women possessed. The propaganda war that accompanied the military conflict placed Margaret at a severe disadvantage due to contemporary attitudes about gender and political authority. Yorkist writers portrayed her as an unnatural woman who had abandoned her proper feminine role to pursue masculine activities of warfare and governance. They depicted her as a foreign influence corrupting English government and leading the weak king into policies that served French rather than English interests. Margaret's alliance with Scotland represented both a practical necessity and a propaganda disaster for the Lancastrian cause. Scottish military support was essential for maintaining resistance to Yorkist forces, but it required territorial concessions and provided ammunition for enemies who accused the Queen of sacrificing English interests for personal advantage. The presence of Scottish troops on English soil revived ancient antagonisms and made it easier for the Yorkists to present themselves as the truly English party in the conflict. The Battle of Wakefield in December 1460 represented the high point of Margaret's military leadership and the most decisive Lancastrian victory of the entire conflict. The death of Richard, Duke of York, in the battle eliminated the primary threat to her son's inheritance and demonstrated that the Queen's strategic vision and military planning could achieve spectacular results. However, the brutality that followed the battle, with York's head displayed on the gates of York City, created a propaganda disaster that overshadowed the military triumph. The display of Richard of York's severed head, reportedly crowned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions, was seen by many contemporaries as evidence of Margaret's unnatural cruelty. Whether the Queen directly ordered this atrocity or merely approved it after the fact, the incident became a symbol of Lancastrian brutality that Yorkist propagandists used effectively to win support for Edward IV's claim to the throne. The action violated medieval conventions about the treatment of noble prisoners and alienated moderate opinion that might otherwise have supported the royal cause. The Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461 demonstrated both Margaret's tactical abilities and the fundamental problems facing the Lancastrian cause. Her forces successfully defeated the Earl of Warwick and recaptured Henry VI, but the victory came too late to prevent Edward of York from claiming the crown in London. The citizens' refusal to admit Margaret's army to the capital reflected their fear of military disorder and their suspicion of the Queen's foreign connections and allegedly vindictive nature. Margaret's decision to retreat northward after her victory at St. Albans was criticised by some contemporaries as a crucial strategic error, but it reflected her realistic assessment of the military and political situation. London's hostility to her cause meant that occupying the city would require a costly siege that might destroy the capital without securing lasting political control. The Queen's priority was preserving her forces for future campaigns rather than achieving symbolic victories that could not be sustained. The Battle of Towton in March 1461 marked the effective end of Margaret's hopes for maintaining Lancastrian power through military action on English soil. The massive engagement, fought in a Yorkshire snowstorm, resulted in a catastrophic defeat that scattered her armies and forced the royal family into Scottish exile. The battle's scale and decisiveness made it clear that the Yorkist victory was not temporary, but represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Margaret's years of exile in Scotland and later in France tested her determination and resourcefulness in ways that few medieval women ever experienced. Dependent on foreign charity for her basic survival, the former Queen had to navigate the complex diplomatic relationships of Northern Europe while maintaining hope for an eventual restoration. Her correspondence from this period reveals both her strategic thinking about potential alliances and her maternal concern for her son's education and future prospects. The Queen's diplomatic efforts during her exile demonstrated remarkable political skill and determination. She successfully negotiated French support for a Lancastrian restoration, understanding that French hostility to Yorkist England could be exploited to serve her family's interests. Her agreements with Louis XV of France required territorial concessions that would have been controversial if they had become public, but they provided the military resources necessary for continued resistance. Margaret's relationship with her son Edward during their exile years was intensely close, as she served as both mother and political mentor to the young prince who represented the dynasty's future. She supervised his education in warfare and statecraft, ensuring that he understood both his rights as the legitimate heir to the English throne and the practical steps necessary to reclaim those rights. Their correspondence reveals a strong emotional bond, complicated by the enormous pressures of their political situation. The Queen's alliance with the Earl of Warwick in 1470 represented both a diplomatic triumph and a personal humiliation. Warwick had been her family's most dangerous enemy during the 1460s, responsible for military defeats that had driven them into exile. However, Margaret recognized that Warwick's break with Edward IV created an opportunity for Lancastrian restoration that was too valuable to reject, regardless of personal feelings about past conflicts. The marriage between Prince Edward and Anne Neville, Warwick's younger daughter, sealed the unlikely alliance between former enemies. Margaret's agreement to this marriage demonstrated her willingness to subordinate personal preferences to political necessities, since the match bound her son to a family that had caused enormous suffering to the Lancaster cause. However, the alliance provided the military strength necessary for the brief Lancastrian restoration of 1470-1471. Henry VI's restoration to the throne in October 1470 vindicated Margaret's years of struggle and sacrifice, but the Queen remained in France during the critical early months of the renewed reign. Her decision to delay her return to England proved tragic, as it meant that she was not present to provide leadership during the crisis that led to Edward IV's return from exile. The absence of the Queen, who had been the real driving force behind Lancastrian resistance, left the restored government vulnerable to the political and military challenges it faced. Margaret's landing in England on April 14, 1471, the same day that Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet, marked both the end of her long exile and the beginning of the final tragedy of her life. The news of Warwick's death and the collapse of the military alliance that had made restoration possible should have convinced her to abandon the campaign and return to French exile. But maternal devotion and dynastic pride drove her to continue the struggle against impossible odds. The Queen's decision to continue fighting after Barnet reflected her accurate understanding that surrender would mean the end of not only her own political ambitions, but also her son's life. Edward IV had demonstrated that he would not tolerate surviving Lancastrian claimants, and Margaret knew that compromise or negotiation would only delay rather than prevent her family's destruction. The choice was between certain death through surrender and possible survival through continued resistance. The Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, represented the final catastrophe of Margaret's political career and personal life. The defeat of her forces, the death of her son Edward in the battle, and her own capture brought to an end nearly 3 decades of struggle for the Lancaster cause. The Queen, who had defied the conventions of her age and had nearly succeeded in preserving her family's throne, found herself a prisoner facing an uncertain future. Margaret's behaviour during her captivity after Tewkesbury revealed the depth of her despair and the completeness of her defeat. Contemporary accounts describe her as completely broken by the loss of her son and the final destruction of the cause to which she had devoted her life. The proud woman, who had once commanded armies and negotiated with kings, was reduced to a helpless prisoner, dependent on her captor's mercy for survival. The death of Henry VI in the Tower of London in May 1471, just days after Margaret's capture, eliminated the last obstacle to Edward IV's secure possession of the throne. Whether the former king died of natural causes or was murdered, his death freed Margaret from the complex emotions that had surrounded their relationship during the crisis years. She was now simply a prisoner rather than a queen, and her political significance diminished accordingly. Margaret's 5 years of imprisonment in England were a period of gradual adjustment to her new circumstances and slow recovery from the trauma of Tewkesbury. She was treated with the respect due to her former royal status, but she remained under close guard and had no opportunity to influence political events. Her letters from this period reveal a woman struggling to find meaning in a life that had been devoted to political purposes that no longer existed. The negotiations that led to Margaret's ransom by Louis XIV in 1475 reflected both the French king's sense of obligation to his former ally and his calculation that her continued imprisonment served no useful purpose for Anglo-French relations. The Treaty of Picquigny, which ended the brief Anglo-French War, included provisions for Margaret's release that allowed both kingdoms to close this chapter of their troubled relationship. Margaret's return to France in 1476 marked the beginning of the final phase of her life, a period characterized by financial difficulty, social isolation, and gradual acceptance of her reduced circumstances. The woman who had once controlled vast resources as Queen of England found herself dependent on a modest pension from Louis XIV and the charity of relatives who remembered her former greatness. Her correspondence from these final years reveals both bitterness about her fate and resignation to beyond her control. The former queen's death on August 25, 1482, at a small castle near Anjou, brought to an end one of the most remarkable careers in medieval European politics. Margaret of Anjou had challenged the conventional limitations of feminine authority, had led armies in battle, had negotiated with foreign powers as an equal, and had nearly succeeded in preserving the dynasty she had married into. Her failure was ultimately due to circumstances beyond any individual's control, rather than to personal inadequacy or strategic errors. Margaret's legacy was complex and contradictory, reflecting both her extraordinary achievements and her ultimate failure. She had expanded the possibilities of queenly authority in ways that influenced later royal women, but she had also provided ammunition for critics who argued that feminine political leadership was inherently dangerous. Her tactical military successes could not overcome the strategic impossibility of her position, and her personal courage could not compensate for the fundamental weaknesses of the Lancastrian cause. The transformation of Margaret from a hopeful young bride into a warrior queen represented one of the most dramatic character developments in medieval history. The 15-year-old girl who had arrived in England expecting a conventional royal marriage had been forced by circumstances to become a military commander, diplomatic negotiator, and political leader. Her evolution reflected both her personal strength and the desperate requirements of the situation she faced, creating a unique figure whose like would not be seen again in English history for centuries. Edward, later known as Edward of Lancaster, Prince of Wales, entered this troubled world on October 13, 1453, at Westminster Palace, carrying upon his infant shoulders the weight of a dynasty's hopes and the burden of a kingdom's expectations. His birth came at perhaps the most critical moment in his family's long struggle for survival. Just 2 months after his father Henry II had suffered a complete mental breakdown that left England without effective royal leadership and the Lancaster cause more vulnerable than ever before. The circumstances surrounding Prince Edward's birth were both blessed and cursed by the timing of political events beyond any mortal control. His arrival provided the Lancaster dynasty with its first male heir in over 30 years, securing the succession that had been in doubt throughout the long, childless early years of his parents' marriage. Yet the prince's birth also came at the precise moment when his father was incapable of acknowledging his existence, creating a tragic irony that would shadow Edward's entire life. The infant prince was born into a court divided by faction and conspiracy, where his very legitimacy was questioned by enemies who sought to use any weapon against the Lancaster cause. Malicious rumours spread by hostile nobles suggested that Edward was not the son of Henry VI, but the illegitimate offspring of one of Queen Margaret's supposed lovers, particularly Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. These slanders had no basis in fact, but they served the political purposes of those who wished to weaken the royal family's position. Henry VI's inability to recognise or acknowledge his newborn son created one of the most poignant scenes in English royal history. Contemporary chronicles describe how the infant Edward was brought to his father's presence, but the king, lost in his mental illness, stared blankly at the child without any sign of recognition or understanding. This tragic moment symbolised the broader crisis facing the Lancaster dynasty, as the father, who should have protected and guided his heir, was instead absent in all but physical presence. The appointment of Richard, Duke of York, as protector during Henry VI's illness placed Prince Edward in an extremely precarious position despite his infant status. York had his own claims to the English throne and had long resented the Lancaster family's hold on royal power. The existence of a Lancaster heir, even an infant one, represented a fundamental obstacle to any Yorkist ambitions for the crown, making the child prince a target for political manoeuvring and potential violence from the moment of his birth. Queen Margaret's fierce maternal protectiveness toward her son became the defining characteristic of her political activity from the moment of his birth. Every decision she made, every alliance she forged, and every battle she fought was ultimately motivated by her determination to secure Edward's inheritance and protect his life. This maternal devotion transformed Margaret from a conventional medieval queen into a warrior leader who would challenge armies and defy conventions to preserve her child's rights. Prince Edward's christening in Westminster Abbey in January 1454 was a magnificent ceremony designed to emphasize his legitimacy and his importance as heir to the throne. The infant was baptized with holy water in the presence of the greatest nobles of the realm, his godparents including the Duke of Somerset and other prominent Lancastrian supporters. The elaborate ritual was intended to establish Edward's unquestioned position as the rightful heir to both the English and French crowns, answering through ceremonial splendour the whispered questions about his parentage. The young prince's childhood was dominated by the political crisis that engulfed his family. During the late 1450s, Edward grew up in royal residences that were sometimes refuges and sometimes fortresses, surrounded by guards and courtiers whose loyalty to his family was constantly being tested. His earliest memories would have been of urgent conversations conducted in hushed tones, of sudden departures in the middle of the night, and of the fear that permeated his mother's court as the political situation deteriorated. Edward's education was carefully supervised by his mother, who ensured that he received instruction appropriate to his status as heir to the throne. The young prince learned Latin, French, and the other accomplishments expected of medieval royalty, but he also received practical training in warfare and governance that reflected the urgent realities of his family's situation. Unlike his father, who had been educated for peace, Edward was being prepared for a life of conflict and struggle. The prince's formal investiture as Prince of Wales took place on March 15, 1454, when he was just 5 months old. The ceremony, conducted while his father was still mentally incapacitated, was controversial but necessary to establish Edward's legal position as heir to the throne. The infant prince was dressed in miniature royal regalia and carried through the ceremonial rituals by his noble sponsors, creating a scene that was both touching and politically significant. Henry VI's recovery from his mental illness in December 1454 brought joy to the Lancaster household, but it also intensified the political crisis that threatened Prince Edward's future. The king's resumption of power led directly to the First Battle of St. Albans, where Yorkist forces challenged royal authority through armed rebellion. The 3-year-old prince was too young to understand the significance of this event, but it marked the beginning of the violent struggle that would dominate his entire life. Edward's experiences during the early phases of the Wars of the Roses were shaped by his mother's determination to keep him safe, while also preparing him for his future role. The young prince was often moved from one secure location to another as military fortunes shifted, never staying long enough in any place to establish the kind of stable home life that might have nurtured a different personality. This constant movement and the atmosphere of perpetual crisis created in Edward a character marked by determination, courage, and perhaps a premature hardness. The prince's presence at the Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461, when he was just 7 years old, marked his first direct involvement in the military conflicts that consumed his family. Contemporary chronicles report that Edward, despite his tender age, witnessed the battle and its aftermath, observing the brutal realities of medieval warfare that would shape his understanding of power and survival. Some sources even suggest that the young prince was consulted about the execution of captured Yorkist knights, though this may be hostile propaganda designed to portray him as precociously cruel. The Battle of Towton in March 1461 resulted in the most catastrophic defeat the Lancastrian cause would suffer during Edward's childhood. The massive engagement fought in a Yorkshire snowstorm saw his family's forces comprehensively defeated, forcing 8-year-old Edward to flee with his parents into Scottish exile. The journey northward, conducted in winter conditions and pursued by hostile forces, must have been terrifying for a child who had known only royal palaces and gentle treatment. Edward's years of exile in Scotland marked a crucial phase in his development from protected child to hardened warrior. The Scottish court, while providing refuge to the Lancaster royal family, was a harsh environment where survival required constant vigilance and political maneuvering. The young prince learned lessons about loyalty, betrayal, and the realities of power that no formal education could have provided, experiences that would shape his approach to the struggles that lay ahead. The prince's separation from his mother when she travelled to France to seek support for the Lancastrian cause must have been deeply traumatic for a child who had relied on her strength and protection throughout his short life. Edward remained in Scotland with his father, whose mental fragility made him an unreliable guardian, forcing the boy to develop independence and self-reliance at an unusually young age. This premature maturity would later be remarked upon by contemporaries who observed the teenage prince's confidence and determination. Edward's reunion with his mother in France around 1463 marked the beginning of a new phase in his life, as he entered adolescence in the sophisticated but dangerous world of the French court. The French king Louis XV recognized the propaganda value of the exiled Lancastrian heir and provided resources for his education and maintenance, though always with the calculation that the young prince might prove useful in future diplomatic dealings with England. The prince's education in France combined courtly accomplishments with military training, preparing him for the dual role of Renaissance prince and warrior leader. Edward learned the refined manners and cultural sophistication valued at the French court, but he also received practical instruction in the martial arts and military strategy. His teachers recognized that this prince would have to fight for his inheritance rather than peacefully inherit it, and they prepared him accordingly. Edward's growing understanding of his family's political situation during his teenage years brought both determination and frustration. The young prince grasped that he was not simply waiting to inherit a throne, but would have to conquer one, that his birthright had been stolen and could only be recovered through military action and political maneuvering. This knowledge created in him a fierce determination to reclaim what was rightfully his, combined with resentment toward those who had usurped his family's position. The prince's relationship with his father remained complex and somewhat distant despite their shared exile. Henry II's continuing mental fragility and his pacific temperament contrasted sharply with Edward's growing militancy and determination to fight for his rights. The son recognized that his father's weakness had contributed to the family's downfall, and while he remained dutifully respectful, there was an underlying tension between Henry's preference for peace and Edward's recognition that only warfare could restore their fortunes. Edward's deep bond with his mother Margaret continued to be the defining relationship of his life throughout his exile years. Queen Margaret had devoted herself entirely to her son's cause, sacrificing her own comfort and dignity in the endless quest for support and resources to mount a restoration. The prince understood the depth of his mother's commitment and reciprocated with a fierce loyalty that made him determined to vindicate her struggles through ultimate victory. The diplomatic negotiations that led to the unlikely alliance between Queen Margaret and the Earl of Warwick in 1470 placed Prince Edward in a difficult position. Warwick had been the Lancastrian family's most dangerous enemy, responsible for victories that had driven them into exile. The prince was now expected to accept this former enemy as an ally, and even to marry his daughter Anne Neville, binding himself to a family that had caused enormous suffering to the Lancaster cause. Edward's marriage to Anne Neville in December 1470 at Amboise in France was a purely political arrangement designed to cement the alliance between the Lancastrians and Warwick's faction. The 17-year-old prince showed little enthusiasm for the match, recognizing it as a diplomatic necessity rather than a romantic union. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward treated his young bride with distant courtesy, but reserved his real affection for his mother and his passionate commitment for the military campaigns that lay ahead. The restoration of Henry II to the English throne in October 1470 should have marked the triumphant return of Prince Edward to his rightful position as heir to the kingdom. However, the prince remained in France with his mother during the critical early months of the Restoration, a decision that would prove fatal to the Lancaster cause. The delay was partly due to practical considerations about gathering sufficient forces for a secure return, but it also reflected Margaret's caution about committing her son to England until the political situation was more stable. The news of Warwick's death at the Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471, the very day that Edward and Margaret landed in England, marked both the end of the military alliance that had made restoration possible and the beginning of the final tragedy. The prince found himself in a desperate military situation, with an untested army facing the experienced forces of Edward IV, but his determination to fight for his birthright overcame any practical considerations about the odds against success. Edward's brief time in England during April 1471 revealed both his military capabilities and his personal courage. At 18 years old, he took an active role in planning the Lancastrian military strategy and helped organize the forces that his mother had gathered. Contemporary sources describe him as confident and determined, displaying a martial spirit that contrasted sharply with his father's pacific nature, and suggesting that he might have been an effective warrior king if he had survived to rule. The prince's decision to give battle at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, reflected both strategic calculation and personal honor. Retreat might have preserved his forces for future campaigns, but it would have meant abandoning his father's cause and fleeing back to French exile. Edward chose instead to risk everything in a decisive engagement, demonstrating the courage that his position demanded, but also the inexperience that made him vulnerable to more seasoned commanders. The Battle of Tewkesbury began with Prince Edward nominally in command of the Lancastrian forces, though experienced commanders like the Duke of Somerset actually directed tactical operations. The 18-year-old prince took his position with the main battle formation, wearing armour that identified him as the heir to the throne and making him a conspicuous target for enemy attention. His presence on the battlefield was meant to inspire his troops and demonstrate his commitment to the cause, but it also placed him in mortal danger. The Lancastrian position at Tewkesbury was strong defensively, with natural obstacles protecting their flanks and difficult ground hindering enemy cavalry charges. However, the tactical dispositions were undermined by poor coordination between different commanders and by the Yorkist ability to use hidden reserves effectively. When the Duke of Somerset's vanguard was defeated and driven back on the main battle line, the Lancastrian formation began to collapse despite desperate efforts to restore order. Prince Edward's actions during the battle remain the subject of historical debate and contradictory contemporary accounts. Some sources suggest that he fought bravely in the thick of the fighting, wielding his weapons with the skill of a trained warrior despite his youth. Others indicate that he was attempting to flee the battlefield when he was overtaken and killed. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes, with a young man trying to rally his troops while also recognizing that the battle was lost and that escape was his only chance of survival. The circumstances of Edward's death are shrouded in conflicting accounts that reflect both the propaganda purposes of different factions and the confusion of medieval battlefield conditions. The official Yorkist Chronicle states simply that Edward was killed in the battle or immediately afterward, without providing specific details about his final moments. Later traditions, influenced by Shakespeare's dramatic portrayals, depicted more elaborate scenes of the prince being captured and executed in the presence of Edward IV, but these accounts lack contemporary support. What seems clear from the most reliable sources is that Prince Edward died at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, ending the direct male line of the House of Lancaster and destroying his mother's lifelong efforts to secure his inheritance. Whether he fell fighting in the main battle, was killed during the rout that followed the Lancastrian collapse, or was executed after capture, the result was the same. The last Lancastrian prince lay dead on an English battlefield, his blood mingling with that of thousands of others who had died in the long struggle between the rival royal houses. Edward's burial in Tewkesbury Abbey was a simple affair lacking the elaborate ceremonies that should have marked the interment of a Prince of Wales. His body was laid to rest in the choir of the Abbey Church, marked initially by a simple plaque that acknowledged his royal status, but celebrated no achievements or virtues. The modest grave reflected both the poverty of his supporters and the determination of his enemies to minimize his significance even in death. The prince's death at such a young age, before he had the opportunity to demonstrate whether he possessed the qualities necessary for effective kingship, made him a figure of tragic potential rather than proven achievement. Those who supported the Lancaster cause mourned not just what Edward had been, but what he might have become, a strong king who could have restored his family's fortunes and vindicated his mother's sacrifices. His enemies, while celebrating the elimination of a dangerous rival claimant, could not entirely escape the sense that something pitiful had occurred in the death of this young man. The rumours and legends that grew up around Prince Edward's memory reflect both the propaganda purposes of different factions and the natural human tendency to romanticize tragic young figures. Lancastrian supporters depicted him as a noble youth, whose potential greatness was destroyed by Yorkist treachery, while their enemies portrayed him as a cruel and vindictive prince, whose death spared England from future tyranny. The truth, as always, was probably more complex and less dramatic than either partisan account. Edward's legacy to the Lancaster cause was paradoxically both its greatest hope and its ultimate tragedy. His existence had provided a focus for loyalist resistance and a reason to continue struggling against Yorkist rule. But his death removed the one person around whom future restoration efforts could have been organised. Without a legitimate male heir to embody Lancaster claims, the dynasty's future depended on distant relatives whose connection to the royal line was tenuous and whose ability to inspire loyalty was questionable. The prince's relationship with his father Henry VI, whose own death followed just days after Edward's, remains one of the most poignant aspects of the family tragedy. The two had lived much of their lives apart, separated by exile and military necessity, and Henry's mental condition had prevented him from providing the paternal guidance that Edward might have benefited from. Yet the destruction of both father and son within days of each other symbolized the completeness of the Lancaster dynasty's collapse and the futility of all the sacrifices made in its defense. Edward's brief marriage to Anne Neville, which lasted less than 6 months before his death, represented another tragic aspect of a life cut short before it could fulfill its promise. The young widow would later marry Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, creating an ironic connection between the Lancaster heir and the man whose brother had destroyed the Lancaster cause. This marriage alliance demonstrated how quickly political alignments could shift in the brutal world of 15th century English politics. The memorial to Prince Edward in Tewkesbury Abbey, restored in 1796, bears a Latin inscription that captures the pathos of his brief life. Here lies Edward, Prince of Wales, cruelly slain whilst but a youth. Anno Domini, 1471, May 4th. Alas, the savagery of men. These words, composed centuries after his death, express the universal human response to a young life destroyed by political conflict, transcending the partisan divisions that had led to his death. The cult that briefly developed around Edward's tomb in the years following his death suggests that some contemporaries viewed him as a martyr, whose innocent blood had been shed for political ambitions. Miracles were reportedly performed at his grave, and flowers were left by pilgrims who saw in his death a symbol of the broader tragedy that had consumed England during the Wars of the Roses. However, this cult never achieved the significance of that surrounding his father Henry VI, perhaps because Edward's warrior prince image was less conducive to saintly veneration. Edward of Lancaster's tragedy was that of potential forever unrealized, of a young man prepared from birth for a role he would never have the opportunity to fulfill. He represented the last hope of a dynasty that had ruled England for 60 years, and his death marked the definitive end of that family's hold on royal power. Whether he would have been a great king, a mediocre ruler, or a disastrous monarch remains forever unknowable, one of history's perpetual questions that can never be answered. The prince's life and death serve as a reminder of the human cost of dynastic politics, of the way that children born into royal families become pawns in games played by adults pursuing power and ambition. Edward never chose the burden placed upon him at birth, never asked to be the last hope of a failing dynasty, never sought the military conflicts that would ultimately claim his life. Yet he accepted these burdens with courage and determination, displaying qualities that might have made him an effective ruler if circumstances had been different. Henry, later known as Henry VII of England, entered the world on January 28, 1457, at Pembroke Castle in Wales, into circumstances that seemed to promise only obscurity and danger rather than royal destiny. His birth came during the darkest hours of the Wars of the Roses, when the Lancaster cause appeared nearly extinguished, and survival rather than sovereignty seemed the best that the family's supporters could hope for. The baby born that winter day carried Lancastrian blood through his mother's line, but his path to the throne would prove to be one of the most improbable journeys in English royal history. The infant's father, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, had died just 3 months before his son's birth, a victim of plague contracted while fighting for the Lancastrian cause in Wales. Edmund had been the half-brother of Henry Tudor, the son of Queen Catherine of Valois' secret marriage to the Welsh courtier Owen Tudor. His death left his widow, Margaret Beaufort, alone and vulnerable at just 13 years old, giving birth to a child whose future seemed as uncertain as the political situation surrounding them. Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, was one of the most remarkable women of her era, combining deep piety with political acuity and an unwavering determination to advance her son's interests. Though barely more than a child herself when Henry was born, she recognized that his Lancastrian blood, however distant the connection, might someday prove valuable if the political situation shifted. Her own descent from John of Gaunt through the legitimized Beaufort line gave Henry a tenuous claim to royal lineage, though it seemed highly unlikely that this claim would ever amount to more than a historical footnote. The baby's birth was attended by circumstances that later chroniclers would interpret as omens of his eventual greatness. Contemporary accounts speak of unusual signs in the heavens and mysterious portents that supposedly marked the occasion. Though these stories were likely invented or embellished, after Henry's eventual success made such tales seem significant. What is certain is that the child was born into a world of conflict and uncertainty, where survival would require more than royal blood or divine favour. Henry's earliest years were spent in Wales, where his mother's remarriage to Henry Stafford provided some degree of protection and stability. However, the young boy's Lancastrian connections made him a potential target for Yorkist forces, and his safety could never be taken for granted in a kingdom where political fortunes could shift overnight, and yesterday's protected noble could become today's hunted traitor. His mother's constant concern for his security shaped his early childhood and instilled in him a wariness that would characterize his later political dealings. The Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 and the deaths of Henry VI and Edward of Lancaster transformed young Henry Tudor's position from that of an obscure, distant relative to the primary Lancastrian claimant to the English throne. At 14 years old, he suddenly became the focus of loyalist hopes and Yorkist concerns, a development that made England far too dangerous for him to remain. His uncle Jasper Tudor, recognizing the mortal danger facing his nephew, made the fateful decision to flee with the boy to Brittany, beginning an exile that would last 14 years. The journey to Brittany in September 1471 was undertaken in desperate circumstances, with Yorkist forces searching for the fugitives throughout Wales and western England. Jasper and Henry travelled through difficult terrain, relying on the loyalty of Welsh supporters who risked everything to shelter them. Their eventual escape from Tenby aboard a ship headed for France represented not just a successful flight from danger, but the preservation of the last serious Lancastrian hope for eventual restoration. Henry's arrival in Brittany began a period of exile that would prove formative for his character and political skills. Duke Francis II of Brittany provided refuge to the Lancastrian fugitives, recognizing that English exiles might prove useful in his own diplomatic dealings with various European powers. The Duke's protection was never entirely secure or unconditional, and Henry lived with the constant awareness that his host's interests might change, and that Brittany could decide to surrender him to Edward IV in exchange for English concessions or support. The young exile's education during his years in Brittany combined the traditional learning expected of a nobleman with practical lessons about survival in a dangerous political world. Henry studied Latin, French, and other accomplishments appropriate to his birth, but he also learned about the complex diplomatic relationships between European states and the ways that exile claimants could be used as pawns in international politics. These lessons proved invaluable when he eventually sought support for his own attempt to claim the English crown. Henry's relationship with his mother, Margaret Beaufort, maintained through occasional letters and messages smuggled between Brittany and England, remained the most important emotional connection in his life. Margaret never ceased working for her son's interests, carefully cultivating relationships with potentially useful nobles in England, while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the Yorkist regime. Her political manoeuvring on Henry's behalf demonstrated both remarkable courage and sophisticated understanding of the complex factional divisions within English politics. The years of exile were marked by periodic crises that threatened Henry's safety and forced him to move between different locations in North Brittany and France. Edward IV made several diplomatic attempts to secure Henry's return to England, offering various guarantees of safety that no one with any political experience would have been foolish enough to believe. Duke Francis II resisted these English pressures while he could, but his own political situation was precarious, and his ability to protect his guests could never be taken for granted. Henry's first serious attempt to invade England came in 1483, prompted by the rebellion of the Duke of Buckingham against the newly crowned Richard III. The conspiracy aimed to place Henry on the throne by combining Lancastrian loyalists with disaffected Yorkists who were horrified by Richard's alleged murder of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. Henry sailed from Brittany with a small force, but storms scattered his ships, and the rebellion collapsed before he could land, forcing him to return to exile empty-handed. The failure of the 1483 invasion attempt, while disappointing, taught Henry valuable lessons about the practical requirements of successful rebellion. He recognized that naval power and favorable weather were essential, that domestic support needed to be carefully organized before foreign landing, and that multiple contingency plans were necessary to account for the inevitable problems that would arise. These lessons influenced his planning for the eventual successful invasion 2 years later. Henry's Christmas Day oath at Rennes Cathedral in 1483 represented a crucial moment in building the coalition that would eventually place him on the throne. Standing before assembled Lancastrian exiles and Yorkist refugees, Henry swore that when he became king, he would marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. This promise to unite the rival houses through marriage provided a powerful symbolic reconciliation that attracted support from those who wanted to end the destructive dynastic conflict. The political situation in England during 1485 created opportunities for Henry that had not existed during Edward IV's secure reign. Richard III's hold on power was undermined by persistent rumours about the princes in the Tower, by his alienation of important noble families through his distribution of offices and lands, and by his apparent willingness to consider marrying his own niece Elizabeth of York after his wife's death. These scandals weakened Richard's position and made rebellion against him seem both morally justified and practically feasible. Henry's relationship with the French court became crucial to his invasion plans when he moved from Brittany to France in 1484. The French king, Charles VIII, saw the exiled Lancastrian claimant as a useful tool for keeping England destabilized and preventing any Anglo-Breton alliance that might threaten French interests. French support provided Henry with financial resources, military equipment, and ships that were essential for mounting an invasion, though this foreign backing also created propaganda problems when Richard III portrayed him as a French puppet. The careful planning that characterized Henry's 1485 invasion attempt revealed the mature strategic thinking that exile had forced him to develop. Rather than attempting a direct assault on London or another major English port where Richard's forces would be concentrated, Henry planned to land in his family's traditional stronghold of Wales, where he could expect local support. The invasion route was carefully calculated to allow time for gathering adherents while avoiding Richard's main armies until sufficient forces had been assembled. Henry's landing at Mill Bay near Milford Haven on August 7, 1485, marked the beginning of the campaign that would determine his fate and the future of England. He came with a mixed force of English exiles, French mercenaries, and Scottish volunteers, numbering perhaps 2,000 men. This modest army represented not overwhelming military might, but rather the final gamble of a man who recognized that remaining in exile was no longer sustainable and that he must either conquer or perish. The march through Wales toward the English border demonstrated Henry's ability to inspire loyalty and to present himself as a legitimate claimant worthy of support. Welsh gentry and common soldiers joined his banner as he moved through the countryside, drawn by a combination of traditional Welsh resentment against English domination, Lancaster family connections to Wales through Owen Tudor, and practical calculation that Henry might actually succeed. By the time he crossed into England, his force had roughly doubled in size. Henry's advance toward London was marked by careful diplomacy as well as military movement. He sent messages to potentially sympathetic nobles, offering rewards for support and threatening punishment for opposition, while presenting himself as a righteous claimant, seeking to rescue England from a usurper and murderer. This propaganda campaign was as important as his military preparations, since victory would require not just defeating Richard's army, but also appearing legitimate in the eyes of those who would need to accept his rule. The crucial question throughout Henry's march was the allegiance of the Stanley family, whose substantial military forces could tip the balance toward either claimant. Thomas, Lord Stanley, was nominally loyal to Richard III, but his wife was Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, creating a divided loyalty that made his eventual position unpredictable. Henry's communications with his stepfather sought to secure Stanley's support, while recognizing that the family would likely wait to see which side seemed likely to win before committing fully. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, began with significant numerical disadvantage for Henry's forces. Richard III had assembled a larger army and held the better strategic position, making him the favorite to win a conventional engagement. However, the battle would be decided not by numbers alone, but by the decisions of those who had maintained neutrality while waiting to see how events developed. Henry's courage in personally leading his forces despite the odds demonstrated the desperation of his position and his recognition that this battle would determine everything. The precise details of the battle remain subject to historical debate, but the broad outline is clear. Richard III's army was defeated partly through Stanley intervention on Henry's behalf and partly through Richard's own reckless decision to lead a charge directly at Henry's position. The king's death in battle, the last English monarch to die in combat, transformed the political situation instantly. With Richard dead and his army scattered, Henry's victory was complete, and his path to the throne was clear. Henry's actions immediately after the battle revealed both his political acumen and his understanding of the importance of symbolic gestures. According to tradition, the crown that Richard had worn into battle was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry's head by Lord Stanley on the battlefield itself, creating a powerful image of divine approval and legitimate succession. Whether or not this scene occurred exactly as later described, Henry certainly understood the importance of appearing to have been chosen by fate as well as by military success. The new king's entry into London was carefully choreographed to emphasize legitimacy and to win the support of the capital's citizens. Henry presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a rightful heir who had liberated England from tyranny, carefully managing the narrative to minimize the revolutionary nature of his accession. His claim to the throne combined conquest, hereditary right through the Beaufort line, and parliamentary recognition, creating a multi-layered legitimacy that would prove difficult for future challengers to completely undermine. Henry VII's coronation on October 30th, 1485, marked the formal beginning of the Tudor dynasty and the end of the Plantagenet line that had ruled England for over 300 years. The ceremony followed traditional forms but was enriched with additional symbolism, designed to emphasize divine approval and historical continuity. Henry's advisors worked to present the new king as heir to both Lancaster and York, transcending the divisions that had torn England apart and promising a new era of unity and peace. The king's marriage to Elizabeth of York in January 1486 fulfilled the promise he had made at Rennes Cathedral and provided the symbolic unification that his propaganda had emphasized. By taking as his wife the Yorkist princess, who represented the best hereditary claim of that house, Henry created a dynasty that could appeal to supporters of both sides in the long civil war. The marriage was personally successful as well, producing 7 children and apparently genuine affection between the spouses despite its political origins. Henry VII's early reign was marked by persistent challenges from those who questioned his legitimacy or sought to take advantage of any perceived weakness. The Lambert-Simnel Rebellion of 1487, which attempted to place a pretender on the throne, demonstrated that Yorkist sentiment remained strong and that Henry's hold on power was not yet secure. The king's decisive victory at the Battle of Wakefield effectively ended the Wars of the Roses, but it also showed that eternal vigilance would be necessary to protect Tudor rule. The creation of the Tudor Rose, combining the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster, represented Henry VII's most successful piece of political symbolism. This merged emblem appeared on royal buildings, in official documents, and on coinage, constantly reminding English subjects that the new dynasty had ended the destructive conflict between the rival houses. The Tudor Rose became one of the most recognizable symbols in English history, its meaning instantly understood by all who saw it. Henry's approach to governing reflected the lessons learned during his years of exile and the precarious circumstances of his accession. He was careful to maintain strong royal authority, while avoiding the kind of tyrannical behavior that had undermined previous kings, balanced in his distribution of patronage to avoid creating overly powerful noble families, and shrewd in his financial management to ensure that the crown had resources independent of parliamentary grants. These policies created stability that would allow the Tudor dynasty to endure. The king's relationship with his mother, Margaret Beaufort, remained central to his reign. Margaret served as a trusted advisor and maintained her own substantial influence at court, but she was careful to exercise her power discreetly and always in support of her son's interests. Her survival through multiple regime changes and her successful navigation of dangerous political waters provided Henry with valuable counsel based on decades of experience in the brutal world of English politics. Henry VII's success in establishing a new dynasty where so many previous attempts had failed was due to a combination of personal qualities, favorable circumstances, and learned wisdom. His years of exile had taught him patience, caution, and the importance of thorough preparation. His understanding of both domestic and international politics, gained through hard experience, enabled him to make decisions that strengthened his position without creating unnecessary enemies. Most importantly, his survival instinct, honed by years of danger, made him alert to threats and quick to act against potential challenges. The final years of Henry VII's reign saw the consolidation of Tudor power and the establishment of governmental and financial systems that would survive for generations. The king's attention to administrative detail, his promotion of trade and commercial development, and his careful management of relations with European powers created conditions for the prosperity and stability that England would enjoy during the early 16th century. The dynasty that had seemed impossibly distant when Henry was born in obscurity had become the established ruling House of England. Henry's death on April 21st, 1509, marked the end of an extraordinary life journey from Welsh exile to English king. He had accomplished what had seemed impossible, using intelligence, determination, and patience to overcome enormous obstacles and establish his family on the throne. The crown passed smoothly to his son, Henry VIII, demonstrating that the Tudor dynasty had achieved the legitimacy and stability that the Lancaster line had always sought but never quite secured during its direct rule. The transformation of the Lancaster cause from the broken dynasty of 1471 to the triumphant Tudor rule of 1509 represented one of the most remarkable reversals in English political history. Henry VII had not only reclaimed the throne for his family, but had done so in a way that finally ended the destructive cycle of civil war and dynastic conflict. The Red Rose of Lancaster, which had seemed to wither and die at Tewkesbury, bloomed again in the Tudor Rose, and the family that had lost everything found restoration through the most unlikely of its surviving members. The collapse of the Lancaster dynasty represents one of the most complete reversals of fortune in English royal history, a cautionary tale about the fragility of political power and the ways that even the mightiest families can fall victim to circumstances beyond their control. From the heights of Henry I's triumph, when Lancaster banners flew from Scotland to the Loire, and the family seemed destined to unite the crowns of England and France permanently, to the tragedy of Edward of Lancaster's death on the battlefield of Tewkesbury, the descent took barely 50 years and destroyed hopes that had seemed secure. The fundamental weakness of the Lancaster position, established by Henry IV's usurpation of Richard II, could never be completely overcome, regardless of subsequent achievements or legitimacy gained through successful rule. The precedent that armed rebellion against an anointed king could be justified by misgovernment created a template that future rebels could follow whenever circumstances made resistance seem feasible. Every challenge to royal authority, every noble conspiracy, could point to Henry IV's example as justification for their own actions. The contrasting reigns of Henry V and Henry VI demonstrated the extent to which medieval kingship depended on personal qualities of leadership, rather than institutional structures or legal principles. Henry V's military genius and charismatic authority had temporarily silenced questions about Lancaster legitimacy and united the nobility behind dynastic ambitions. However, his early death and his son's gentle character revealed that such success was personal rather than hereditary, dependent on individual capabilities that could not be passed from father to son, like titles and lands. Henry II's tragedy was that he possessed many admirable human qualities, but lacked those specific characteristics that effective medieval kingship required. His genuine piety, personal kindness, and commitment to peace might have made him a successful monk or scholar, but they were catastrophic qualities in a king facing domestic opposition and foreign challenges. The contrast between his nature and the brutal realities of 15th century politics created a gap that neither his supporters' devotion nor his own good intentions could bridge. Margaret of Anjou's transformation from conventional medieval queen to warrior leader represented both the strength of maternal devotion and the desperation of a cause that could find leadership nowhere else. Her willingness to violate traditional gender roles and personally lead armies reflected her accurate understanding that conventional approaches could not save her son's inheritance. Yet this very activism, while militarily necessary, provided ammunition for propaganda that portrayed her as an unnatural woman whose influence corrupted English government and led the kingdom into chaos. The death of Edward of Lancaster at Tewkesbury marked not just the end of the direct Lancaster male line, but also the destruction of 3 decades of struggle and sacrifice. Queen Margaret's entire adult life had been devoted to preserving her son's inheritance, and his death at 18 meant that all her efforts, all her compromises with former enemies, all her military campaigns had ultimately achieved nothing. The completeness of this failure, the totality of the dynasty's collapse, made the Lancaster tragedy one of the most poignant in English history. The Wars of the Roses, which grew directly from the Lancaster dynasty's fundamental weakness, demonstrated the destructive potential of disputed succession in a medieval monarchy. The conflict consumed the lives of perhaps 50,000 Englishmen, destroyed numerous noble families, devastated regions where battles were fought, and created a climate of political uncertainty that inhibited economic development and social progress. The human cost of the dynastic struggle extended far beyond the royal families directly involved, touching the lives of common people throughout the kingdom. The role of noble factionalism in the Lancaster collapse cannot be understated. Great families like the Percys, the Nevilles, and the Staffords pursued their own interests and ambitions under the cover of dynastic loyalty, switching sides when circumstances made such changes advantageous. Their private armies and regional power bases made them effectively independent powers within the kingdom, capable of supporting or opposing the crown based on calculations of personal benefit rather than abstract principles of loyalty or legitimacy. The financial exhaustion of the English crown, resulting from decades of French warfare and domestic conflict, undermined every attempt to restore Lancaster authority. Medieval government depended heavily on the king's personal resources and his ability to reward supporters with lands and offices. When defeat in France eliminated overseas sources of income and domestic warfare consumed available funds, the monarchy lost its ability to maintain the patronage networks that secured noble loyalty. The propaganda war that accompanied the military conflict revealed the importance of narrative and perception in determining political outcomes. Yorkist writers successfully portrayed the Lancaster regime as corrupt, incompetent, and dominated by foreign influence, while presenting their own cause as a righteous effort to restore good government. This propaganda created an environment where military victories and defeats had multiplied psychological impact, as each engagement seemed to confirm or refute the broader narratives about divine favor and legitimate authority. The religious dimension of the conflict, while often overshadowed by political and military considerations, played a significant role in how contemporaries understood and justified the dynastic struggle. Both sides claimed divine approval, pointing to battlefield victories as evidence of God's favor, and interpreting their enemies' successes as temporary divine punishment for specific sins. The death of Henry VI in royal custody, followed by reports of miracles at his tomb, created a cult that suggested divine disapproval of the Yorkist usurpation, though this religious sentiment never translated into effective political or military support for Lancaster restoration. The international dimension of the Lancaster collapse demonstrated how domestic English conflicts were inextricably linked to broader European politics. French support for Margaret of Anjou's restoration attempts reflected French interests in keeping England divided and weak, rather than any genuine commitment to the Lancaster cause. Similarly, Burgundian alliance with York, Scottish involvement on both sides at various times, and Breton protection of Henry Tudor all reflected calculations about how English internal conflicts could be exploited for advantage in continental politics. The survival of the Lancaster claim through the obscure Beaufort connection that produced Henry Tudor demonstrated the unpredictability of dynastic politics and the way that seemingly minor branches of royal families could suddenly become crucial. Margaret Beaufort's determination to advance her son's interests, despite his extremely distant claim to the throne and years of exile, eventually bore fruit in circumstances that no one could have predicted when Henry was born in Pembroke Castle. Henry VII's success in establishing the Tudor dynasty represented both a vindication of the Lancaster claim and a transformation that made the new regime fundamentally different from its predecessor. The Tudor rose that combined white and red symbolized not just the union of York and Lancaster, but also a new approach to kingship that learned from the failures of previous generations. Henry's careful attention to financial management, his creation of effective administrative systems, and his ruthless elimination of potential rivals created a stability that the Lancaster line had never achieved during its direct rule. The contrast between the Lancaster collapse and the Tudor success revealed how similar dynastic claims could produce completely different results depending on the personal qualities of the monarchs involved and the specific circumstances they faced. Henry VII possessed many qualities that Henry II had lacked: political ruthlessness, financial acuity, and an understanding of power relationships that came from years of exile and danger. These differences in personal capability, combined with the exhaustion of English society after decades of civil war, created conditions where Tudor rule could establish itself in ways that Lancaster rule never managed. The memory of the Lancaster collapse influenced English political culture for generations after the dynasty's end. The Wars of the Roses became a cautionary tale about the dangers of disputed succession, weak kingship, and noble factionalism. Tudor propaganda consistently emphasized how their regime had ended this chaos and brought stability, using the Lancaster failure as a negative example that justified their own, sometimes harsh policies. The red and white roses became powerful symbols, not just of past conflict, but of the importance of unity and strong royal authority. The rehabilitation of Henry II's reputation in the decades following his death, with attempts to have him canonized as a saint, represented a complex mixture of genuine religious devotion, political calculation, and nostalgia for a simpler time before the Wars of the Roses destroyed the relative peace of early Lancastrian rule. The cult around his tomb in Chertsey Abbey attracted pilgrims who saw in the tragic king a martyr whose sufferings had resulted from his virtuous nature rather than from personal failings. This religious veneration, while never achieving official recognition from the church, demonstrated how the Lancaster legacy continued to resonate with common people even after the dynasty's political extinction. The historiographical treatment of the Lancaster collapse has evolved significantly over the centuries, reflecting changing attitudes toward monarchy, gender roles, and political legitimacy. Early Tudor historians portrayed the Lancaster dynasty as tragically flawed but ultimately redeemed through Henry VII's success. Victorian historians, influenced by Romantic nationalism, often depicted the Wars of the Roses as a destructive struggle between rival houses that was finally resolved through the triumph of English spirit under Tudor rule. Modern historians take a more nuanced view, recognizing the complex interplay of personal, political, economic, and social factors that contributed to the dynasty's rise and fall. The architectural and cultural legacy of the Lancaster dynasty, particularly through Henry VI's foundations of Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, represents the positive achievements that survived the political collapse. These institutions, created during the brief periods when Lancaster rule seemed secure and resources were available for such projects, continue to educate students centuries after the dynasty's extinction. They stand as monuments to the intellectual and cultural aspirations of a family whose political ambitions ultimately failed, but whose impact on English education and culture proved enduring. The personal tragedies embedded within the larger political narrative of Lancaster collapse humanize the historical events and remind us that these distant political struggles involved real people experiencing genuine emotions. Henry VI's mental illness and the suffering it caused him and his family, Margaret of Anjou's desperate struggle to protect her son and her ultimate failure, Edward of Lancaster's death before he could fulfill his potential. These individual tragedies resonate across centuries because they reflect universal human experiences of loss, failure, and the gap between aspiration and achievement. The role of contingency and chance in the Lancaster story demonstrates how historical outcomes often depend on unpredictable factors that contemporaries could neither foresee nor control. If Henry I had lived another decade, if Henry VI had inherited his father's character instead of his own gentle nature, if Edward of Lancaster had survived Tewkesbury, any of these counterfactual scenarios might have produced a completely different outcome. The recognition that small changes in circumstances could have dramatically altered the dynasty's fate should make us cautious about deterministic interpretations that treat the collapse as inevitable. The comparison between the Lancaster experience and other fallen dynasties throughout history reveals common patterns, while also highlighting unique aspects of this particular family's tragedy. Like many royal houses, the Lancasters rose through a combination of ability, ambition, and favourable circumstances, then fell when subsequent generations lacked the qualities necessary for maintaining power. However, the specific nature of their usurpation, the long destructive war that resulted, and the eventual restoration through a distant relative gave the Lancaster story distinctive characteristics that set it apart from other dynastic cycles. The impact of the Lancaster collapse on English constitutional development, while difficult to trace precisely, appears significant in retrospect. The demonstration that even anointed kings could be successfully challenged contributed to traditions of limited monarchy and parliamentary authority that would later become central to English political identity. The recognition that royal legitimacy depended partly on effective governance rather than solely on hereditary right-planted seeds that would eventually flower into more systematic limitations on royal power. The literary and dramatic treatments of the Lancaster collapse, particularly through Shakespeare's history plays, have shaped popular understanding of these events in ways that often diverge from historical evidence. Shakespeare's portrayal of Henry VI as weak and ineffectual, Margaret of Anjou as a she-wolf of France, and the entire period as one of chaotic violence has influenced how English-speaking audiences have imagined the 15th century. These dramatic interpretations, while often historically questionable, demonstrate how the Lancaster tragedy has continued to fascinate later generations through its dramatic potential and its themes of ambition, failure, and tragic destiny. The women of the Lancaster dynasty, particularly Margaret Beaufort as well as Margaret of Anjou, demonstrated remarkable political capabilities and personal courage in their efforts to preserve and eventually restore the family's royal claims. Their success in navigating the dangerous world of 15th century politics, in building networks of support, and in pursuing long-term strategies despite immediate setbacks, challenges traditional narratives that minimize women's roles in medieval political history. The Lancaster collapse and eventual Tudor restoration demonstrates how crucial female agency could be in dynastic politics, even in a culture that officially limited women's political participation. The final evaluation of the Lancaster dynasty must balance acknowledgement of its achievements against recognition of its ultimate failure. Henry IV established a new royal line and successfully defended it against multiple challenges. Henry V achieved military glory that briefly made England the dominant power in Western Europe. Henry VI, despite his personal limitations, inspired genuine devotion among many subjects and created educational institutions of lasting value. Margaret of Anjou demonstrated extraordinary courage and determination in impossible circumstances. Edward of Lancaster, though he died before he could prove himself, represented hope for dynastic renewal, and Henry Tudor, carrying the Lancaster claim through his mother's Beaufort descent, finally achieved the secure establishment of the family line that had eluded his predecessors. The Red Rose of Lancaster, which had seemed to wither and die in the bloody field of Tewkesbury, ultimately bloomed again in the Tudor rose that combined it with the White Rose of York. This botanical symbolism captured both the destruction of the original dynasty and the survival of its essential claim through transformation. The Lancaster legacy thus consisted not just of the direct family line's tragic collapse, but also of its eventual vindication through the Tudor success that drew legitimacy partly from Lancaster descent. The Wars of the Roses that resulted from Lancaster weakness and Yorkist ambition created trauma that affected English society for generations. The destruction of noble families, the disruption of social hierarchies, the cultivation of military skills and values that made violence an acceptable response to political disagreement. All these consequences of the dynastic conflict shaped England's development in ways both obvious and subtle. The eventual Tudor settlement that ended the wars represented not just a military or political victory, but also a collective recognition that such destructive conflict must never be allowed to recur. The Tower of London, where Henry VI died and where future princes would be imprisoned, became a physical symbol of the Lancaster tragedy and the brutal realities of dynastic politics. The fortress that had served Lancaster kings as both palace and prison witnessed the dynasty's final destruction and stood as a monument to the violence that political ambition could generate. Its stones, which had seen coronations and murders, victories and defeats, embodied the entire span of Lancaster rule from hopeful beginning to tragic end. The economic impact of the Lancaster collapse, through decades of warfare and political instability, significantly affected England's development during the 15th century. Trade declined. Agricultural production was disrupted in regions where armies campaigned, and the capital that might have been invested in economic development was instead consumed in military expenditure. The eventual Tudor peace allowed economic recovery, but the lost decades of the Wars of the Roses represented opportunities for development that could never be recovered. The diplomatic isolation that England experienced during the later Lancaster period, as continental powers exploited English divisions for their own advantage, demonstrated how internal weakness invited external interference. The French recovery of territories that Henry V had conquered, the Burgundian abandonment of the English alliance, and the Scottish raids across the border all reflected England's diminished international position resulting from dynastic conflict. The restoration of English diplomatic credibility under Henry VII required years of patient work to overcome the damage done by decades of civil war. The cultural flowering that might have occurred under different circumstances, if Lancaster rule had remained stable and resources had been available for patronage of arts and learning, represents one of the intangible costs of the dynastic collapse. While some cultural achievement continued even during the Wars of the Roses, the general climate of uncertainty and the diversion of resources to warfare necessarily limited the kind of cultural development that characterized more stable periods of English history. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the House of Lancaster, a tale that began with a usurper's ambition and ended with a young prince's blood on a Gloucestershire battlefield. We have walked together through the corridors of medieval palaces, stood witness to great battles and greater tragedies, and observed how one family's struggle for power shaped the destiny of a nation. The story of Lancaster is ultimately a human story, one that speaks to timeless themes of ambition and failure, love and loss, courage and despair. Henry III's gamble in seizing the crown from Richard II seemed to promise glory for his descendants, but it planted seeds of doubt about legitimacy that would eventually consume his family. Henry I's magnificent achievements created expectations that no successor could meet, making every subsequent Lancaster king seem inadequate by comparison. Henry VI's gentle nature, so admirable in a private person, proved catastrophic in a monarch facing violent opposition. Margaret of Anjou's fierce maternal love drove her to extraordinary feats of courage, but could not overcome the fundamental weaknesses of her family's position. Edward of Lancaster's tragic death represented the destruction of hope itself, the final extinguishing of the direct Lancaster line, and Henry Tudor's eventual triumph demonstrated how even the most complete dynastic collapse could be reversed when determination combined with favourable circumstances. The Red Rose of Lancaster, that ancient symbol of royal dignity and dynastic pride, was watered with so much blood during the 15th century that it seemed it must wither forever. Yet from that apparent death came rebirth, as the Tudor rose combined red and white in a symbol of reconciliation and renewal. The dynasty that had lost everything found restoration through the most unlikely of its surviving members, vindicating decades of struggle and sacrifice through final triumph. As you drift into peaceful sleep, perhaps you might reflect on the lessons that the Lancaster tragedy offers to our own time: the importance of personal character in leadership, the dangers of disputed legitimacy, the human cost of political ambition, the resilience of hope even in desperate circumstances. All these themes resonate across the centuries, speaking to fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend the specific circumstances of medieval England. The ghosts of Lancaster, gentle Henry VI in his prayer chamber, fierce Margaret on her battlefield, young Edward falling at Tewkesbury, remind us that history is made by real people experiencing genuine emotions, not by abstract forces or inevitable processes. Their struggles, their hopes, their failures, and occasional triumphs were intensely personal, even as they shaped the broader course of national history. And so we leave the Lancasters to their rest, the dynasty that rose so high and fell so far, whose story encompasses both the heights of military glory and the depths of tragic defeat. Their legacy lives on, not just in the Tudor rose that survived them, but in the cautionary tale they provide about the fragility of power and the unpredictability of fate. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be gentler than the nightmares that haunted the House of Lancaster during their tragic century of rule and ruin. Until we meet again in another historical tale, I remain your companion in these midnight journeys through time, here at Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the entire history of the collapse of the Lancasters. If you found peace in these medieval whispers, please do leave a gentle like on this video. It truly helps others find these soothing tales. And don't be shy about sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment in the Lancaster story touched your heart? Which character's struggle resonated most deeply with you? I love reading your reflections, and your kind words encourage me to continue creating these peaceful historical journeys. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sleepy Crown, so you never miss our nightly adventures through history. We have so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more dynasties to explore, so many more gentle voices from the past, ready to guide you toward restful sleep. Until tomorrow night, sweet dreams, dear friend, and may the red rose of Lancaster bloom in your sleeping thoughts as a reminder that even from the greatest tragedies, new hope can eventually grow. Good night.